No, I don't know why you're not there. I gave you my love, but you don't care. So what is right and what is wrong? Give me a sign. What is love? The dilemma the singer faces in Hathaway's hit song from 1993, What is Love, is very similar to the one that Percy Jackson faces in the first season of Percy Jackson and the Olympians on Disney+, which aired for the first time in December of 2023 through January of 2024. With a second season now being confirmed to release in December of this year, I felt compelled to return to that first season because I realized, as the 1-year anniversary passed of the show coming out, that I hadn't actually sat down and watched it all the way through since it came out. Not because I didn't like it, I fell into the vast majority of people who felt neutral to good about the show, but it didn't blow me away either when it came out, so I just didn't really get around to watching it again. But a year later, I, for some reason, really wanted to go back and rewatch it, mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about the reception that it got from other fans, and specifically the many ways that that reception baffled me. Because while a lot of fans really liked the show when it came out, a lot of fans also really didn't like it. And once the show started airing episodes weekly and the hype steadily dropped as people discussed changes made to the show and the various aspects of it that they didn't agree with, as a new fan, I remember being really confused and sort of discouraged by that discussion. Some critiques I agreed with, but mostly I just felt like the conversations were overwhelmingly negative. Maybe unnecessarily negative, if you will. And so, a year later, I wondered if I went back and watched the show again, once the dust had settled, if I would feel any differently towards it. Would I like it less, or would I like it more, or just stay neutral? Full disclosure, I sort of expected to not like it, or at least to feel the same about it. For some reason, I went in with this assumption that I would just not enjoy the show that much. And I think it's because those negative opinions about the show really stuck with me more than the positive ones. But I was wrong. I watched the show back in January for the first time. Again, I've since then had to rewatch it many times in order to prepare for this video. And I was surprised by just how much I actually really enjoyed it, to the point where the most consistent note that I had for every episode was just, I don't really understand what the problem was. This is fine. You might wonder, well, if you watched the show back in January, then why are we here 6 months later getting the video now? And that's because it's that long that it took me to finish writing the script for this, because I thought this video would be simple to make. I really did. I thought, well, I'll rewatch the show, I'll probably have some criticism of it, and then I'll just record that, and it'll be quick and it'll be fun, and end of story. But then I really liked the show, which made my job a lot harder, because then I had to switch paths and figure out what I wanted to say about the show then, because at that point I was invested in this idea. So I decided that I would try and sort of play a lawyer and defend the show against the critique that fans of the show, I think, have heard over and over and over again. But I quickly realized that that was, first of all, boring. It's just sort of not very compelling. And also, it put me in a bad mood. Maybe not so surprisingly, sifting through critique after critique of a show that you really like, I think it's just not good for your general mood. So I scrapped that idea, and then I realized I actually had something else that I wanted to talk about, which was a lot more fun, at least for me, because it didn't rely so much on other people's criticism of the show. It was more just my take and my analysis of the show. So that brings us here. What is this video exactly then? Well, it's a little bit of everything that it once was. My goal with this video is to try and do my best to explain why I think Percy Jackson and the Olympians Season 1 on Disney+, it's kind of a mouthful, was and is a good adaptation, and do my best to explain what it is that the show does that I think is really compelling. It's not so much a defense as much as it is an earnest attempt at analyzing the show's text, nor is it so much an attempt at convincing you that you have to like the show or that you're wrong if you didn't like the show, because I think honestly you're allowed to have your own opinion, so much as it is just a personal love letter to a show that I have now rewatched many times and have grown to actually earnestly love. So if you're up for that, how do you take my hand? Take my hand. Come here. Let's discuss Percy Jackson together. This is sort of a part 1-ish. This is just some more context for those who are unaware of what Percy Jackson is, just so we're all on the same page. Percy Jackson was first created in 2004-ish by, at the time, an English teacher by the name of Riordan. I really hope that's how you say it. I can never tell. Rick worked as a writer alongside his teaching job and had previously written an adult crime mystery series. But Percy Jackson, the character, was born while Rick was telling his son Haley, who is ADHD and dyslexic, a bedtime story about Greek mythology. The story goes that Rick ran out of actual Greek mythology to tell, and so Haley asked him to just come up with something, and so Percy Jackson was born. And once the bedtime story was done, after 3 nights of telling the tale of Percy retrieving Zeus's master bolt, Haley suggested that Rick turn it into a children's book, and the rest is pretty much history. The first book in the series, The Lightning Thief, was published in 2005, with the following 4 of the first installment coming out through 2010, with The Last Olympian being released in February of that year. And in that same year, the first book of the next installment, Heroes of Olympus, was released in October, titled The Lost Hero. The 5th and last book in Heroes of Olympus, The Blood of Olympus, was released in October of 2014. The story of Percy Jackson was far from over, though, with the following series, Trials of Apollo, featuring cameos from Percy and other beloved characters from the first 2 series, and Magnus Chase and the King Chronicles also feature overlaps and features that sort of create what the fans call the Riordan verse. Like they're all connected. It's like Marvel. I don't know anything about Marvel. It's like Marvel, right? That's the whole point. They're all like, you know what I'm saying. The books were and are hugely successful, with many of them becoming bestsellers upon release. And of course, the first 5 books getting a major movie release in 2010, which is where our story gets complicated. If you don't know anything about Percy Jackson and you just clicked on this because you're bored or you needed something to watch while you're eating, good choice. But if you don't know anything about Percy Jackson, I would bet that you would be most likely to know that there's something about the movie adaptations that the fandom is sort of weird about. More specifically, you might know that the fandom absolutely hates the movies. And if you know the books at all, then you know that that's for a good reason. The first of the 2 movies, The Lightning Thief, was released in 2010, and the following and final movie, The Sea of Monsters, was released in 2013. Neither films performed all that well, and the fans outright hated the films so much that it pretty much resulted in the movies ending there, even though I'm pretty sure they were set to make filmatizations of all 5 books. Fans will know that it was actually so bad that Rick himself wrote a long email to the producers of the film, begging them to change the script, or at least let him supervise. But they didn't listen, and that ended really well. Due to the movie's somewhat catastrophic scale of failure as an adaptation, it's often one of the first things that you learn as a new fan, that the movies suck. And as mentioned earlier, I was new to the books until about a year before the show came out. So even though I was really new to the fandom, I knew that A, fans hated the movies, and B, equally yearned for an actually good adaptation. So when the show was announced in 2021 with Rick and Becky Riordan on the team to help supervise, with Rick even writing on a few of the episodes himself, fans were beyond elated. The Lightning Thief had since been adapted into a stage production as well as a musical, and though this was technically considered the superior adaptation before the show was announced, it was still a fan-made project and it wasn't a real screen adaptation, so it wasn't the same. But the show was going to do it right. Fans had waited a full 10 years since the movie's release for an accurate and well-done adaptation on the big screen. And for a while, it seemed like they were finally getting just that. Just a straight-laced, 100% accurate adaptation of The Lightning Thief. People who worked on the show all seemed to be in agreement that they were going to make a Percy Jackson show that was as faithful to the books as possible. But it didn't take long before fans began to wonder what exactly that meant. While the hype for the show was largely consistent and people were mostly just just genuinely excited to see the show. There were a few bumps in the road. Firstly, the cast announcement for the main trio sort of put a little bit of a halt into some fans' excitement.
We don't have time to unpack all of that.
Besides the obvious racism of that whole thing, the overall question that fans sort of started to ask around this point was, but didn't you just say that you were going to make an adaptation that was as faithful as possible to the books? How is this faithful to the books? And while most fans, myself included, didn't really care about the casting and instead continued to look forward to the show because at the end of the day, it's not about what they look like, it's about whether or not they translate the story, right? Subtle foreshadowing. Some fans saw it as like the first crack in the idea that the show was going to be 100% faithful. And then the show came out and that small crack began to deepen because the show came out, as mentioned, on a weekly basis, which meant that in between episodes, fans were left to discuss, for better or for worse, the changes made to the show and what they thought was going to happen next. These discussions started out as somewhat neutral. People gave the show a lot of grace with the 2-episode premiere, and for the first couple of episodes, people were very lenient with their critique. The general sort of vibe for the critique had this air of, well, it's still really early on, and surely the show is going to reveal that it was all part of a grander design, that they kept changing this and that they kept this bit out, etc., etc. But then the episodes kept coming out and no explanations were given, and thus the critique surrounding the changes in the show became the focus of the discussion in the fandom. I don't have many TikToks saved from when the show came out, but I pretty much remember the experience of going online after an episode would release being 20% jokes and just general fangirling, and then 80% slideshows from people where they would just go over everything that they disliked in that episode. Maybe I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, but my point is that the reception of the show among fans was widely diverse. And for whatever reason, the fans with the most negative opinions became the loudest. Ain't that just the way? And admittedly, this video also took 6 months to make, not just because I kept changing direction, but also because I kept thinking about scrapping the video entirely. The reason I kept going, however, is because every time I thought about quitting, it was like the universe would slap me in the face with some kind of dumb critique and I would be forced to return to the script to keep going. Because I kept thinking to myself that, oh, surely other people have rewatched the show and then come to the same conclusion as me, so what is the point really of making this video? Because surely people are over this, right? They're not still saying the same thing. But then one day after I had considered quitting again, I went on TikTok, as one does for their daily dopamine/depression cocktail. I was met with a video like a sign from the gods with a text saying, "Has it been enough time yet that we can all admit that the Percy Jackson show was terrible?" It had a bunch of likes and a bunch of comments, and at that point, I knew exactly what these people were going to say about the show. I had been reading through enough Reddit posts to know. But it's not just that people dislike the show that I disagree with. People are allowed to have their opinions, they're allowed to not like the show. But what bothered me, and what still bothers me, is that the discussion and critique of the show is incredibly surface level and very cyclical. It's all the same argument being repeated over and over and over again. And I think that that's a shame. I think it's just a surface level ripple in the deep sea of the show's text to just discuss these changes and nothing else. That's a really annoying way of saying that it's too simplified. It's too basic. It's not actually critique either. It's just good old-fashioned flaming. Do kids know what flaming is? Look it up. And I could be okay with that if it was treated as that, but the general gist in the fandom is that this kind of critique is the best way of deciding whether the show is good or not, when in reality, in my opinion, it's not real critique, it's just playing a game of spot the difference between the book and the show. And I'm kind of sick of it, to be honest. So I guess while I don't necessarily consider this video to be an attempt at defending the show in the way that a lawyer would, it's very dusty, this jacket. I am, I guess, still somewhat considering this my main defense of why I think the show should be given more credit. I could have sworn that I had like a, you know, like a little pocket up here for the call now and get your own golden pen. It's actually not meant to be riptide. I got it at my graduation. I don't have a pocket for it. I guess I'll just hold it. That won't be distracting when I'm waving it around. So without any further ado, let's hear from our sponsor. No, I'm sorry. I don't have any sponsors. And thus, here is my analysis of the show. We tend to think of divorced or complicated families as a modern invention, and that is not at all true. You only have to read the Greek myths to see broken homes, widows, divorce, stepchildren, children trying to get along with new parents. So, our first problem when discussing the show as a fandom is the word fidelity, or faithful, accurate adaptations. Because while it is everywhere, and I mean everywhere that I had to look at opinions about the show, that term pops up, usually it is meant to say that Percy Jackson and the Olympians Season 1 was not faithful or accurate to the books, ergo it is a bad show and a bad adaptation. And maybe unsurprisingly, none of these people ever seem to agree on what exactly they meant by faithful to the books. People use it in regards to plots, characters, costuming, casting, sets, direction, writing, acting, everything. And that's because fidelity in adaptation is a very complicated topic and much too complex for us to use in just one way. We tend to have the general opinion as fans that fidelity equals good, so terms like accuracy and faithful become global signifiers, where inaccurate automatically means bad and faithful or accurate automatically means good. And don't get me wrong, fidelity is a valid and somewhat necessary thing to discuss when we analyze an adaptation, because the baseline requirement for an adaptation is that it is, at least in part, based off of something pre-existing. But while it is valid to discuss fidelity, it's not always helpful to discuss it when we're trying to analyze and consider an adaptation. In order for it to be helpful, we have to zoom in on what we actually mean with fidelity. As I mentioned earlier, there's any number of things that we can consider in an adaptation in order to decide if it stays faithful to the source material or not. So first we decide what kind of fidelity we want to discuss, and secondly, we have to discuss not just if the adaptation is faithful, but in what manner it is. And when it isn't, what the adaptation then offers up instead, and if those changes hold merit to the artistic value of the work. The problem when we treat fidelity as an overarching term, as if the act of creating an adaptation is a pass-fail exam that entirely hinges on its ability to retell the source material in a new medium, but in the exact same way as the original, is that we disrespect the artistic value that the adaptation might have by overlooking the majority of it in order to focus on just that aspect of it. Because adaptations are not just adaptations. They don't exist to stand in or copy the source material. They are their own artistic work, with criteria that are tied inherently to the respective medium, which the source material cannot cover. Because a book will always be a book, and a TV show will always be a TV show, and they, funnily enough, don't have the same artistic criteria in order to determine whether they are successful as artistic works. That's a very complicated way of saying that we can't judge them the same way. A book is not a TV show, and vice versa. But secondly, we also disrespect the source material by reducing it to a laundry list of plot points, dialogue, and settings that the adaptation has to check off in order to succeed, which is, in my opinion, not where the soul of a story lives. But we'll discuss that more in a second. So how do we discuss fidelity then? And what kind of fidelity should we focus on? That's an excellent question. You can pick literally any aspect of an adaptation to focus on, but in order to keep the section short and to cut straight to my point, I have decided to borrow from James Harold's article, The Value of Fidelity in Adaptation. In his article, Harold defines two kinds of fidelity that can be valuable when we're looking at an adaptation. The first one is story fidelity, and the second one is thematic fidelity. Story fidelity, Harold defines as when the adaptation is successful in telling the same story as its source material, it presents the same points in the same chronological order, with the same scenes, settings, and characters, so that we, the audience, essentially get more or less the same experience when taking in both works, the adaptation and the source.
You're identical. You're the same. You look the same. In both dress and speech and name, you're similar, if not indistinguishable.
Yes. I suppose.
Okay.
And to a lot of fans, that one might seem like the ideal fidelity to focus on. But Harold and I both argue that it isn't really all it's cracked up to be. The problem with story fidelity is that it's not really that great of an artistic endeavor. Translating a book to a screenplay is relatively straightforward if you really want it to be. Both forms of writing have enough similarities and traits in common that the writer could, if they wanted to, treat the narration in the novel as stage direction and the dialogue as well dialogue, and then end up with a story-accurate script. And even if they were more economical about it and had to cut things out, because books, especially novels, tend to run on for longer than a screenplay will allow, both a script and a novel still have the main intention of presenting a narrative. The language used to do so is just different in the respective mediums, from script to prose. So story fidelity can result in the same feeling as taking in the source material.
You're identical. You're the same.
But it doesn't really require that much artistic thinking on part of the maker of the adaptation. But what about thematic fidelity? Themes are often not something that writers inject directly into their writing. It's typically something that they might consider but don't decide on until the job is already done. However, in adaptations, the job is done. The adaptation can then choose one or more themes from the source material and focus on bringing those out in the new medium, because especially if it's a screen adaptation, they can use more visual tools to support those themes. The reason Harold and I argue that thematic fidelity is more integral to creating a good adaptation, artistically speaking, is that the themes tend to support the thesis of the work, the overall moral or message that we as an audience are supposed to consider. Themes are, in my opinion, where the soul of the story lives, not in that aforementioned laundry list. If an adaptation succeeds in understanding and translating the themes of the source material, then it tends to be considered a faithful adaptation even when it makes changes to its story. Because in truth, most adaptations have to cut some story out. If it's a book-to-screen adaptation, are you tired of me saying that word yet? Then some story changes are unavoidable. And so the question isn't how much of the story do we need to bring into the adaptation. The question is which parts of the story are integral to the theme of the source material so that those parts can be brought into the adaptation. And as a quick side note, because I forgot to write it into my script, it's not that story fidelity and thematic fidelity can't coexist. It's not that they're exclusive to one another. They actually typically tend to coexist in an adaptation. It's just that if you focus on one, you tend to lose out on the other. So if you focus on thematic fidelity, you'll have to change more of the story in order to adapt and support that theme. And if you focus on the story, then you get technically a more accurate translation of the source material, but you might lose out on the themes because it's going to be focused more on just getting those plot points out and not actually giving any kind of artistic addition to those plot points. To illustrate this point, that thematic fidelity tends to win out over story fidelity, what better example to give than to use the movie adaptation of The Lightning Thief and the show. If we compare the movie and the show adaptation of The Lightning Thief, using that laundry list that I mentioned, we can quickly see that both works technically do tick off quite a lot of those plot points. We have Percy's home life being a mess. He gets attacked in a museum by his first monster. He's then given the pen sword.
Hang on to that. It is a mighty instrument.
This is a pen. This is a pen.
He, Grover, and Sally go to camp and are attacked by the Minotaur. Sally gets crushed. Percy wakes up at camp, learns his mom is dead, ? Everyone wants to talk about Don't Walk on My Roof. No one wants to talk about... No.
No. All of it was real. My mom's gone.
I hate it when that happens. Anyway, sorry. And learns the ways of life at camp. Percy gets the quest. He goes on the quest. We have the bus, Medusa, casino, underworld. Then we have the betrayal and fight on the way back. Bolt is returned, a tender moment with Dad, and then Percy goes back home and Gabe dies. The end. Okay, I kind of sped through that, but this is just to say that if you really, really wanted to be generous with the movie, it does technically tick off a lot of those integral plot points that people wanted to see in the show as well. And you would think that that results in a somewhat okay remaking of the book, right? So why doesn't it feel faithful? It's the theme. The theme is missing.
No. All of it was real. My mom's gone.
And because the themes support the thesis of the work, we start to feel like the movie maybe just doesn't have that much of a thesis. I mean, they changed the characters' ages to start at the most integral age that they end up at. That kind of goes against the whole thesis of the book. So we end up with this feeling of what's the point when we watch the movie? Everything just becomes a big spectacle with no weight to it. The emotionality of the story gets washed out. In contrast, we have the show, which also makes story changes, but these, despite what some people might argue, are warranted, or at least more warranted than the movie, because the show makes thematically driven story changes. Remember when I said that we can't just argue about whether or not the show is accurate to the book, but also whether or not the changes that it makes are warranted and have artistic merit? That's what I'm talking about here. When the show makes changes to the story, it is done to support the theme and in extension the thesis of the show, which is unsurprisingly similar to the statement made by Riordan in his 2010 The Guardian interview. We can, for example, look at a scene a lot of fans were disappointed by due to the changes made by the show. The Tunnel of Love scene. In the book, the scene features these mechanical spiders, and this is considered important to Annabeth's character because she has this whole thing with spiders that we really don't have time to get into right now. But in the show, we instead get a scene with Hephaestus' backstory and a short but very meaningful conversation between Annabeth and Percy, and eventually Hephaestus himself. And while I can see how the character development of Annabeth being afraid of spiders could be seen as important to the show, I think the interaction between Percy and her is both development for their characters, put a pin in it, we'll get to it when we get to it, and integral to the theme of the show, which is family, specifically the complexities of family and how messy the Olympian family is.
Yeah, that isn't really how it works. It's kind of a one-way sort of thing. It can't be undone.
How do you know?
Because I built it.
Having a member of said family show up and reckon with the unfairness of it all feels to me more poignant and compelling, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the theme of the show is in the forefront of the text. It wants to tell a story about family and the complexities of family structures. You could almost say it wants to talk about family systems. And if we disregard the spot the difference mentality for a second, we can actually see the text of the show pointing this out to us in the very first episode. First we get Sally and Percy's first flashback scene in the Met, and I'm going to be bringing this scene up a lot, so I'll keep it brief for now. But Sally tells Percy not everything that looks like a monster is a monster, and not everything that looks like a hero is a hero. After which we get introduced to Nancy Bobofit, and then Grover and Percy discuss Nancy, where Grover tells us that there are many schools of thought as to why people become bullies, feelings of inadequacy, childhood trauma, and here is where the show already tells us that we are going to be looking at the source material in a new, different way. We are not interested in the action here, which we already kind of know as fans. We are interested in the motivations behind those actions. We're not looking at a retelling of The Lightning Thief. We are looking at a show that aims to broaden and heighten our understanding of the books. To explore the theme, the soul of the story, not the action and dialogue itself, because, to quote Echidna, this was always a family story. So with that said, let's look at how the show expresses its thematic fidelity in the text.
In a certain light, you might say it looks sort of blue. Blue.
I did my nails for it as well. Do you like them? I actually really didn't like this nail polish, but I did it for you. Like and subscribe. One of the first places we can look at to see the theme reflected in the show's text is the use of color. I am trying not to sound snide here, but the fact that I have yet to see even just a color analysis that goes like in depth into the colors is just disappointing. What's going on? I thought we were all English majors here. Whatever. But I digress. So let's discuss the use of color in the show, because typically colors are the gateway drug of analysis. That's why your English teacher always cared so much about those curtains that were maybe not blue. And speaking of blue, Percy Jackson and the Olympians uses blue primarily, as well as gold and yellow, to symbolize the complex struggle between humanity and godhood, specifically in Percy, but also in general. Blue is first and foremost associated with Sally Jackson, and if we extend that line of thinking, then we can also see it as a representation of humanity, mundanity, and the comfortable home environment, safety, motherhood, nostos, essentially. Is that how you say it? Nostos? Nostos? How do you say it? I don't know. Gold, in turn, becomes the color of divinity, power, and danger. It's the color associated with Kronos, which I would take to mean fatherhood because he is the father of the gods, and also a color that represents the past, as Kronos is the lord of time, and because we know that the age that Kronos ruled over is known as the Golden Age. It also, through its connotation to Kronos, who we'll remember started the family's negative behavior patterns, becomes the color of hurt and trauma in itself. These two colors show up a lot in the show, but the difference between a good color analysis and a it's not that deep analysis is that you know when to pick them out, and that you can discern when the show is probably trying to tell us something with those colors and when the show puts those two colors together because they look nice. Firstly, we can see an excellent use of these colors in the very first episode of the season. When we first see Percy, he's on the roof of his school gymnasium, and what's he wearing? He's wearing yellow, because gold flannels are pretentious, and he would never wear that. And the color of the lighting here is very cool toned. When Percy is in the human world, in these flashbacks, it tends to be very blue toned. That makes his yellow flannel and his blonde hair stand out more. Then, as the principal, teacher, I don't know who this guy is, comes up behind him. While his shirt is technically white, the color grading, which we have to remember is a conscious choice on part of the showmakers, makes it look blue in contrast to what Percy's wearing. So, symbolically, Percy is starting to open up his eyes to the magical world around him, and the human world sneaks up on him and drags him back to safety by force. It's also important to note, when Sally and Poseidon discuss this incident, Sally describes Percy in that moment as becoming more of a target. He's starting to draw attention to himself.
It's starting to attract attention from your world. The winged horse followed him to school. It saw him, he saw it. Sooner or later, it's not just gonna be pretty things that are following him.
And in the scene, we can see how a monster would see Percy. He stands out. Then, immediately after, Percy sits wrapped in blue clothes with even darker blue lighting, as he's told that it's just in his head and that there's nothing to worry about. But there's a spotlight on his face that is slightly warmer, as if he isn't entirely sold on this idea. And then when Percy sits at school, lonely and confused in the human world, he looks out the window and sees an automaton. Is that how you say it? Automaton. Automaton. Is it automaton? It can't be. It has to be automaton. A golden automaton. And he's quite literally in the human world here, looking out at little glimpses of magic, but he is very much separated from it. And then, as Percy says himself, something changes in his world. He meets Grover, and immediately the lighting changes. It's brighter, it's golden, and it's clearer. We can see everything a lot better. And what does Grover do in this scene? He introduces and deepens Percy's understanding and connection to the mythological world. But is Percy completely in the know yet? No. Because while the lighting is clearer and our vision is sharper to the little details around us, Percy is literally blinded by it. Look at this shot. You think that wasn't intentional? You think they didn't notice that? Because to him, it is still just imagination. It's just a game. It's strange, but harmless. And to really drive home this point, we can also look at our first appearance of a god, or several, except not really, because I'm talking about the statues in episode 1. I mean, It's beautiful. It's so well done. Because the very first one that we see in the Met is this blue oxidized copper, while the Met behind the statue looks more yellow than I would even say cream or white because of the color grading. And then the other two that we see aren't that same oxidized blue, but again, the show deliberately color grades them to look more blue and yellow. In the darkest statue that we can see, we literally see blue and gold reflected in the statue. That's a good use of color, because these are not the actual gods. These are human-made attempts at capturing the gods' likeness. And if we understand implicitly that this world is in fact real and happening all around us, then it's sort of odd to see them here as just statues. They're replicas of actual magic, blue and faded in the museum, while the actual magic goes on behind them in that yellow background. And if you're thinking that we're in too deep already and that this is dumb and critical thinking is hurting your head, then buddy, let me tell you, this is child's play. This is the kiddie pool. We haven't even hit the iceberg yet. I don't know what that means either, just roll with it. You want to get in too deep? Okay. We can get in a little deeper. We can talk about the fact that copper oxidizes depending on the air pollution in the environment that they're in. It's a combination of water and oxygen and other chemical components. Hi, I'm not a scientist, obviously, but those components turn the copper from a golden brown to a matte blue greenish color, almost like how the air pollution of civilization shapes and changes the appearance and behavior of the gods in the Percy Jackson universe. What? Oh my god. Okay, but that might be too deep, so let's focus on the colors again. If we move ahead a little bit, we get that first flashback again between Sally and Percy in the Met. The lighting once again does a really wonderful job at showing us how Percy is half boy, half god, all hero. Firstly, we have Sally and Percy standing together with a golden light fixture shining a spotlight on them from behind. And that light fixture looks suspiciously like the nymph that we see later on in the show, but
Now, we don't have time to unpack all of that.
now pay attention to Percy's outfit in this scene. He's wearing mostly blue. Sally herself is also wearing blue, but she is actually covered up by her beige jacket. Not yellow, not gold, just beige. And honestly, full disclosure, I think that this is mostly just to make Percy pop a little more in this shot, but you could also reach a little. See, reach with me. We're reaching. And say that this could show us that Sally is mostly just a part of this mundane world. And I say that with love, but she is representative of like humanity and like the mundane side of Percy's life. She's not part of the magic here. Now, what's more interesting is that when the characters turn to face each other, something interesting happens in the difference between how the light affects Percy and how it affects Sally. Percy turns to his mother, and his face is half covered by golden light, while the other half remains untouched by it. And I hear you saying, yeah, you dimwit, that's how lighting works, but not so fast. Let's look at how it affects Sally. When Sally turns, her face is not covered at all. It touches the periphery of her, but it doesn't touch her person, which, considering that she is a mortal who can see through the mist, makes a lot of sense for her character, right? And for the record, I am an artist. I'm not going to get pretentious about it, but I will say that Sally here has the larger surface plane between the two of them. Logically, she should be touched by the light. That sounds like a metaphor, but it's not. But she isn't, which feels very deliberate. It's not the only time that the show does this with Percy. If you know to look for it, it's truly so often that they use this lighting on his face. If we move ahead to the Jackson apartment, we get our first look at present-day Sally. And oh, what's this? She's bathed in blue from the rain outside as she lets it soak her. Oh, interesting. What's this? The way that they framed this shot is so that the wallpaper, which I always thought was weird that it wasn't blue. I just always assumed that the Jackson apartment would have blue wallpaper in some way. But I get why, because the way that they framed it is so that it becomes this golden square behind her. She's now in reverse to the position that Percy was in that earlier shot that we were talking about, where the magical world is behind her not next to her or in front of her. But the interesting thing is that she can still enter into this magical world. She enters through the window and she goes to hug Percy, who then says, "I'm all wet now," because her humanity is part of him. It bleeds into him. They're connected. Also, water, something, something, Poseidon, something, something. In the cabin in Montauk, when Sally finally tells Percy the truth of his heritage, the lighting once again frames half of Percy in this golden glow. And we also get the backgrounds to really hone in on that divide that is between him and his mother already. If we look at how Sally is framed, she is mostly framed with blue colors behind her, and the kitchen of the cabin, which looks very similar to their kitchen in their home. She's also lit up by the fire from the hearth that they're sitting at, but it's less vibrant than the light on Percy, which is more saturated and sort of sharp. Percy, however, is framed by yellows and golden colors. There's even a white bunk bed behind him. Like, he almost already looks like he's in cabin 11. He already belongs to this different world, he just doesn't realize it yet. Meanwhile, Sally is still stuck in the human world. She's still symbolically stuck in their apartment. We get more uses of these colors as the show goes on, and one way that we can see specifically Sally not being able to really be a part of that divine magical world is in her scene with Poseidon. Here there is a window behind them, or at least I think it's a window, which is what? Gold! And it runs from Poseidon towards Sally, where it's obscured by some fixture of the cafe's interior. The divinity literally gets cut off and partially obstructed by Sally's status as a human. And she's wearing blue to top it off. Then when Poseidon looks at Percy after he and Sally have just discussed that they think that Percy should stay in the mortal world a little longer in order to make him stronger before he goes to camp, Percy is also obscured by this blue tinted window. He's still protected and partially hidden from the magical world. He's not really a part of it yet. But he's still wearing that yellow color, so it's only a matter of time. And is there more, you ask? Of course there's more. We've covered like 10% of the show. But I'll speed through these ones because I have a feeling that by now you probably get the point. First and foremost, we have Cabin 3, which is of course Percy's real home at camp, which is actually not blue but sea green. It almost looks blue, but it isn't. It's not quite blue, which is appropriate because it's not quite home, but it's also a blend between yellow and blue. It's sort of halfway there. Half boy, half god, all hero. We could also look at how Sally and Poseidon mirror each other to a certain extent in these. I'm going to assume that I have the screenshots up on the. Sally in episode 1 pretty much claims Percy by telling him that he's not broken, he's singular, he's a miracle, and he is her son, and she loves him. While bathed in a glue light. I hope not. How will she get it off? Well, bathed in a golden light. And then in episode 8, I don't know why I wrote episode 7, it's episode 8. Meanwhile, in episode 8, when Poseidon more silently claims Percy as his son, he has that little moment with him, they are in a much more blue lighting. Further, we have Medusa's house and kitchen being blue while she is still appealing to Percy's humanity and reminding him somewhat of his mother. Medusa herself compares the two, calling her and Sally sisters. But in her basement, where her victims are and where Medusa chooses to continue her legacy as a monster, the lighting is golden. We also have some other statues that we could probably talk about. I see probably we are going to talk about them, you don't have a choice, which is of course the golden statues of Sally and Percy. Percy gets swallowed by gold and cast as a statue as part of Hephaestus' trap. That's really hard to say. Hephaestus' trap. That's significant in itself, but I think what is most interesting about this scene is that he actively chooses to do so. He accepts that he must do it, and while he's clearly not happy about it, he continues to reassure himself and Annabeth that he's okay. But when he's finally released, he's gasping for breath. He was being suffocated by it. In symbolic terms, this, to me, feels like the sacrifice to the divine. To become a true demigod hero in the classical Greek sense, you have to sacrifice part of your mortal self. You forego living in order to be cast forever in this golden glow. You'll stand the test of time, you'll never truly die, but you'll also never truly live either. And while Percy willingly gives himself over to this and comes out of it alive, he is not well when he is released from it. It was not good for him to be stuck in that. And because we know where Percy's arc is headed, we can see this as foreshadowing of his future choices. Because as the story goes on, Percy gives himself over more and more to this godly side of him, before eventually choosing to be free from it and clinging to his humanity. Sally is in a similar situation, although not quite. She is mortal, she's not a demigod, and yet she is protected in gold as well when she enters the magical world of the show. But she's also neither living or dying while she's in that state. I take this to mean as both a sign that the gods do kind of treat mortals as just bargaining chips and as just items that they can use, and also that Sally and other mortals would have to have some kind of godly protection in order to go into the magical world. They can't succeed or thrive in that environment if they don't give up part of their life as well. They would have to also become immortal in some way. I really hope I can edit that to make sense, because I can't keep doing takes of this. If we skip around a little bit again, we can also see the golden symbolism in pretty much all things that the show considers to be powerful, ancient, and dangerous. We have Riptide, we have the Chimera, we have the Helm of Darkness, and the Master Bolt, of course, and we also have the Ichor of Ares, which is also a great example of how like power and danger is tied to gold. But those are pretty easy to read and pretty much exactly what they say on the tin, so I'm not gonna really focus on them. I'm just gonna go back to the more subtle uses of color. That's more fun anyway. So specifically, there are two moments that I think about more than I perhaps should from episode 8. First, I want to discuss the flashback scene with Luke and Percy. I have a lot to say about them as characters, so for now, we'll just look at the colors. If we look at their flashback when they're training and then when they're talking about the gods and their family system, Luke's version, the colors behind them are golden, but mostly they're golden when we're looking at Luke. Percy is shaded by much more blue toned shadows behind him, and the sun is haloing Luke, not him. Percy is still grounded in his own worldview. He's still not really indoctrinated into this system yet, but Luke is. And not only that, we know that he's already under the influence of Kronos at this point, and Kronos is directly tied to the color of gold, so it makes sense that the colors behind him are much more golden. But interestingly enough, there's a moment when Percy comes back to camp where he shares a moment with Thalia's tree, and the sun is now behind him. He is now in the system. He's part of this world, and he gets it. He's not blinded by it anymore or manipulated by it, and he sees everything clearly. And he sees his position within it in relation to Thalia. He's not dead yet. He gets to walk away, but she didn't. And I think Percy in that moment realizes just how close he was to landing a similar fate to her. And that's not only good writing, that's great cinematography. Especially because the sun isn't directly behind him and it's not like completely overtaking the background. He's managed to keep it at a distance. He hasn't been swayed by Kronos, but it almost looks like he's still looking at him. Like it sort of looks like an eye in the background as well. Like Kronos is still keeping an eye on him. And if we look at the very end of episode 8, when the quest is done and they're all going home, or Grover is going out to search for Pan, Percy wears a yellow jacket over a blue shirt. And oh, what is Annabeth wearing? Why, I oughta. She's wearing blue. And she's not just wearing blue, she's like stacked blue. Like her whole outfit is blue. Oh my god, what could that possibly mean? So why do these things matter? It matters because the show couldn't do this if it didn't understand its theme. It couldn't play with colors and other visual things like that are more subtle if it didn't know what its thesis was and knew how to support it with thematic uses of color, for example. I promise I'm almost done with this, but there's one more thing that I would like to talk about. So, full disclosure, I didn't love the design of Olympus when the show came out at first. I've changed my mind since then, but at first I didn't really like it. Specifically, I didn't like the throne room. I think I just always pictured it as being so much grander and, you know, like white columns. And for some reason, the only comparison I have is like, you know, in Hercules, like the Disney movie Hercules, like just like a big rectangular structure. So I struggled a little bit to see how an epic fight scene could play out here, given the limited space. However, I have since changed my mind, partly due to the colors actually. So when we see Olympus and when we see the throne room, it first strikes us that it is somewhat worn down. It's kind of falling apart. And the floor is beautiful, with these swirling blue and gold colors. I don't even know what to make of that. You tell me what you make of that. I don't know. I can't analyze all of it. But the structures around them are just ruins. And you could write a whole analysis of just that fact alone, but what really struck me as I rewatched the scene over and over again while preparing my longer analysis is that if you look at the background, you can see these lines of gold that run through those structures, and we can see them sort of reflect in the light almost as if they're alive. And I guess you could see them as veins of ichor running through these structures as if it's blood of Olympus keeping it alive, but I don't see it that way. To me, these don't look like veins, they look like scars. Scars of the past, of Kronos. And they're scars that haven't healed. They continue to wear down on the entire structure of Olympus. Kronos is always there as a marker of the family's history, and none of the gods have really fully processed what happened to them. And for Zeus, this is the ultimate leverage point when discussing family business, because all he needs in order to shut up his family is to point around him and show them the very visible scars of their past. He can just point to them and go, look how painful our past was. Look how horrible it was for all of us. Compared to that, what they have now is sacred, it's balanced and harmonic. And clearly this tactic works because not even Poseidon can speak up to Zeus when it really comes down to it. But to us and to Percy, we can see how frail everything is. It's a mess, as Percy would put it. And Percy might just be the thing to fix that.
I've connected the two dots.
You didn't connect shit, but
I've connected them.
So, we've established that the theme of the show is family structures, and specifically the complexities of those family structures. But in order to properly analyze the family structure that we're introduced to in the show, I thought it would be best to define what a family structure might look like and how it plays out in the show's text. In order to understand why everyone is like that, I have decided to use a model which was first used by Sharon Wegscheider-Cruse in her 1981 book, Another Hope, A Second Chance for the Alcoholic Family. Now, hey, quick disclaimer. Yeah, that book is pretty old to use as a source. And yeah, the system might have gotten a little bit of critique in later years for lacking scientific research to back up its existence. But luckily, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a scientist. So we're only going to use this as far as it is helpful in understanding what a family system is and how the roles and rules of those systems might play out in a dysfunctional family, so that we can understand the Olympian family system better. And the book was, as the title suggests, written for families affected by substance abuse disorders, but it can also be extended and used to understand other types of dysfunction in a family. For example, abuse, generational trauma, narcissistic personality disorder in parents, etc., etc. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know is what a family system is. And a family system is just another way of saying dynamic. So when I say healthy system, I just mean a healthy dynamic, and vice versa. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, it is like 1 in the morning when I'm recording this, and I have rewritten this part so many times that I'm probably going to use them interchangeably. So that's okay though, they all mean the same thing. According to Wegscheider-Cruse, all families, healthy and unhealthy, function within a system, like parts of a machine where each member of the family carries out a role in order to keep the family afloat and thriving. She writes in her book, In a family, the components are, of course, the members. While the classic family dynamic includes a mother, father, and one or multiple children, not all families fit that pattern. Today, more and more families have only one parent as an active member, and fewer have a grandparent, aunt, or other member of the extended family living in the home. Even an absent or deceased person may continue to be a member if he still exerts a strong effect on the functioning of the family. For example, as author of the rules, the silent critic or model of what to be or not to be. So if we are to build an Olympian family system, if you will, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly because this is not your typical family, it's the Greek pantheon. So there's a lot of moving parts to consider. So I have constructed a pyramid of sorts. I'm assuming that I've done that in post, otherwise that's going to be really awkward to try and explain. So in her book, Wegscheider-Cruse describes family systems as a mobile hanging from a ceiling, but I think that for our Olympian family system, it is more prudent to use a pyramid because it is very much a hierarchy. Dare I say it's a pecking order of power and control. So if we have our Olympian family system, I'm assuming that I've made one. At the very top of our Olympian family system, we have Kronos in a sort of parentheses. And Kronos is essentially a deceased family member, even though he's not technically dead. We're supposed to assume that he's dead, but he still functions as an active member of the family. And to Luke, he functions as an ideal, this hazy, nostalgic rule maker of the past that he can try and embody, literally. And for the gods, Kronos, or to the gods, Kronos is a cautionary tale, the original author of their system that they have since improved. And he also functions as a silent critic, as we know from Percy's dreams.
So weak, so scared, so sad.
I would also categorize, if we're just gonna look at like the sidelines and like who is more of it like difficult to place, I would also categorize Hades as a silent critic, even though he's not deceased, he just rules over the deceased, but he's very much a silent critic.
I don't really do jealous. My brothers, on the other hand.
And if we're still looking outside our pyramid, we also have absent family members in Dionysus, and if we count the books, Lester Apollo. I'm not trying to say his last name. I'm not going to say Lester's Papadopoulos. Is that how you say it? Lester Apollo. We're going to call him Lester Apollo. And those two members are not absent by choice. They are exiled as punishment. Although Dionysus is more sent away to rehab, and Lester Apollo is shunned in a more classic sense. Even so, Dionysus still functions as an active member of the Olympic Council, and he's still regarded as part of the family. We can see that because he still gets invited to holidays, and he also gets recalled to Olympus when things go wrong and they need him back. But in the day-to-day, he functions as an example to the other gods of what happens if you don't follow the rules. And if I had a nickel for each time my favorite character in a book series was a grumpy, middle-aged man who functions as an example of what happens if you don't follow the rules, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Also, as a side note, before we get into it, I'm not going to count the minor gods into this system because that would just be too much to try and figure out. And they don't really have much to say in the books, and they're not really considered part of the system in the books. So that sucks for them, but it makes my job a little easier. So we're just not gonna count them in here. Okay, so our actual system. We have, of course, at the very top of the hierarchy, Zeus as our functional rule maker. He decides how things go, he has the upper hand in negotiations, and he seemingly has veto rights against everyone else, despite it being a council, which would make you think that it's more of a democracy, but it isn't, because he's in charge. Everyone answers to him, and we're supposed to view him as the patriarch of the family, despite not being. Well, he's not the father of all of them. Next, we have the rest of the gods. I'm going to break away from the classic Wegscheider-Cruse system where everyone else besides the rule maker / rule makers are considered the rule keepers, and instead I'm going to call the gods the rule enforcers. Because the gods still have to answer to Zeus, but they have more HP points. so they get more free will. They can move about a little bit more in terms of what they do, even if they are restricted by their own set of rules. So while they answer to Zeus, they have to carry out their role in the microsystem, and their main job in the system is to enforce the rules of the system onto the demigods. They punish and reward the demigods based on their performance as rule keepers. However, it also gets a bit tricky here because in order to understand the psychology of the individual gods and their respective children, we have to layer this section into 3 groups. Because there is a clear distinction between the gods of who gets the most benefits from the system and who are most loyal to it, and conversely, who seemingly get the least benefits from the system and who are the most against the system. So, editing aims, we need 3 tiers in the god section. So for the top tier, we have Ares, Zeus, and Athena as the gods in the "There's no trauma in Olympus" section.
Ares is that way. Zeus is that way. My mother is that way.
Ares is by far the most positive and outspoken of the gods when it comes to praising the system. He speaks of it very fondly, and he explicitly says that he loves how messed up his family is.
We betray, we backstab, we will push anyone down a flight of stairs to get ahead. And that's why I love my family so much.
Which makes sense because he benefits from it and he would thrive in it. He's the god of war and conflict, so of course he's into that. Because if we look at the dynamic between Ares, Hephaestus, and Aphrodite, we can see that there is a clear power dynamic between them and that Ares is on top. Hey, no, not like that. Maybe like that. I don't know. It's Greek mythology. It's very possible that he is like that. Because we know that Ares and Aphrodite are able to have an affair with little to no consequences. And if we compare to Dionysus, he was exiled for having an affair with a nymph that Zeus liked. Now, obviously, Zeus is a bigger power here than Ares is, but even so, there is a bit of a similarity between Dionysus and Hephaestus in that neither of them are able to speak up against or act out against this kind of treatment. Because if Hephaestus was on the same level as Ares in the system, we would assume that he would be able to stop this behavior or punish Ares in a way that mattered, but he seemingly can't. So,
in spite of what my brother might have told you, I am not someone who'll be pushed around.
Oh, you're kidding. He met her here? In her husband's park?
Pecking order. They're bad parents, Percy. Zeus is pretty self-explanatory. He set the system in place, but he's also the most dependent on it. His well-being depends on whether or not the other gods get along with him and agree with the system. He has to exert a lot of control over the others in order to maintain his position, but because of that control, he gets the most benefits from it, so obviously he is for the system.
That is what we do. We snap and plot and stride. We'll declare my swift and crushing victory.
And Athena you might wonder about as to why I'm choosing to put her in this section, but that's because compared to the next tier, which is more like 50-50 morally gray, where the gods neither oppose or support the system clearly, Athena has given no signs in this season that she is uncomfortable or disapproving of the system that she's actively enforcing by sending monsters into her own temple to punish Annabeth.
That's what a good mother does for her children.
So she's going here until we know more about her. And I would say that this is okay with me. I feel like in this house we respect women's rights and wrongs. Because if we get an arc where Annabeth has this change in mindset and then she slowly starts to break down and rebuild her mom's mindset in regards to the system, I think that would be really neat to have between them. So I'm okay with Athena starting out in the "There is no war in Ba Sing Se" section. Next up, we have the aforementioned 50-50 club. These are the gods who have not given enough information for me to know exactly where they stand. They're neither fully supportive or fully against it. So here we have Poseidon, Hades, Hermes, Dionysus, and everyone else that we haven't met yet. Poseidon and Hermes both give minor hints that they're not happy with the system, but none of them are explicit enough that I would count them as being angry with the system itself. It seems more like a personal remorse, not a systematic like need for change. Hermes does admit that it isn't fair, none of it is in episode 6, but that alone doesn't mean that he's arguing that it should change.
It isn't fair. None of it is.
Thanks. That's super helpful.
Similarly, in the flashback where Poseidon and Sally talk about Percy's future, Sally says that Poseidon doesn't want to hear why she doesn't want him at camp, and Poseidon replies,
Probably not. But you have no one to say it to. And maybe that's the most unfair part of it.
which is nice, but it's not really given the same clear distaste as a certain other member of the system.
I am not someone who'll be pushed around.
And then Hades, in comparison, is kind of in a parentheses here, because he is fine with saying that his family is unhealthy and dramatic and all that, but he also doesn't express any desire to change. He's probably accepted his position in the pecking order and doesn't really bother to try and fight back, which I think, again, knowing what his full arc is, sets him up really nicely for that whole development, with Nico trying to sort of push him to join the fight.
Why would I want that? I don't know if you noticed, but it's all candy canes and rainbows down here. I'm managing just fine.
So I'm good with that. And then finally, we have the bottom tier, which is the womp womp, my family sucks tier. And of course, we have Hephaestus in this tier. We could argue that Lester Apollo again, if we want to take the books into account as well, and Dionysus could fall here, but Dionysus's actions are not really enough to actually put him in this tier. He enforces the system just as much as he can kind of acknowledge that it's not right. In fact, I would argue that he actually is more for the system than against it in the show. He does admit to Percy that, you know, it doesn't look good for you, kid. Like, yeah, it's like unlikely that it's you that stole the bolt, but like, what can you do? But in the same breath, he also enforces the system by forcing Percy to take the quest and punishing Grover for standing up for himself. Either way, Hephaestus, oh, and obviously Lester Apollo is in the books. He's a long ways away from ever getting on the screen. So Hephaestus is the most outspoken against the system of the gods. He states that not all of the gods want to be that way either. And that is really interesting. First of all, he doesn't give an itemized list, which I could have honestly really used here.
Some of us don't like being that way either.
Thanks. That's super helpful.
Whatever, it's fine. I don't need to know exactly who is against the system. I mean, I know that we're probably going to see it in future seasons. I'm just saying right now it would have been useful for this, but whatever. Do you see that? That was some dust. It's like a little feather. But it's also the only thing that any of the gods say that like actually signifies a want for change in the system, not just being upset at the system.
I know your mother was displeased with you recently. We both know how she gets. But this was a lot.
Which is interesting because he does say that some of us don't like being that way either. So if multiple of the gods want change, that's really significant. And then of course, the final tier of the system is the demigods, who function as rule keepers and weirdly, as Luke tells us, rule breakers. So they don't enforce the rules the way that their parents do, but they do continue the cycle by essentially just bringing new demigods into the rules. And because the gods enforce the rules onto the demigods, they all sort of support this belief that the system is beneficial to them, even though it's also part of their job to, I guess, technically break the rules for their parents. I would certainly not consider it part of their title because, as Karen puts it,
Mr. D was taking advantage of that.
So it's not that the demigods have to break the rules, it's just that the gods need them to know the rules so they can be broken when the gods need them to. Speaking of rules, we should probably define what those are and how they work at Camp Half-Blood.
Acting like you know the way ahead, like you know the rules.
There are no rules, ma'am. We're lost.
No.
In the show, we obviously get a complex family structure presented to us, and it's the Olympian family. But in order to understand why everyone within that system behaves the way that they do, we have to establish how the rules of a dysfunctional family look. So, that was a very Scandinavian so. So, typical rules of a dysfunctional family tend to look like this.
Our turn.
1. Control. Everything and everyone has to be controlled in order to prevent emotional pain and to manage the chaos of the system.
This is a sacred valley, Percy. Humans can't see it. Monsters can't enter it. The world can't touch it. 12 cabin, the 12 Olympian gods. Each cabin is home to the children that God has claimed.
Great, which one am I?
You haven't been claimed, Percy.
Our parents make it so hard. Stretching us and twisting us and hacking off pieces to make us seem more like them.
Two, perfectionism. Standards are unrealistic and inhumane, and failing to perform to the standard is seen as a catastrophic moral failing, not a chance to grow and learn.
We tried to get it to you on time.
You failed.
I guess Mr. D wasn't too happy you told me about my mom.
No.
No, he was not.
She said my impertinence wounded my mother's pride, and that will be my doom. It embarrassed her. Now she's angry. She isn't gonna help us when we get to the top to save Percy.
Who stole it?
You did.
What?
3. Blame. Responsibility is avoided and blame is shifted whenever something goes wrong, which creates an environment of resentment, suspicion, and confusion.
Has claimed you. This is his will.
Poseidon has ignored me my entire life.
You are his son.
Considering my grandmother is your great-grandmother, and this has always been a family story, this isn't your fault. But sadly, you're going to have to bear the burden of your parents' mistakes today.
A daughter of a self-righteous mother who chose self-righteousness for herself. You could choose to save your mother instead of doing your father's bidding. If neither of you will help teach these lessons, perhaps you should be the lessons.
Percy, none of this was meant to betray you. The gods are my enemy. You're bad parents, Percy.
He wants you both weakened.
I will not be weakened by my brothers.
4. Denial. Serious issues are ignored, rationalized away, or simply denied when brought into the light.
You got the boy to camp alive. Don't overthink it.
Yeah, but it's...
Of course he's gathering strength. Of course he's coming. That is what we do. We snap and plot and stride. It was only a matter of time before he did again.
You walk out of here with that shield, and you're a hero on your way to the greatest glory. She will be proud, and you will be forgiven, and all will go back to being as it always has been.
Sorry. He waited as long as he could.
And 5. Unreliability. Promises and commitments are betrayed frequently, which creates general mistrust between family members.
I guess we're all just doing the best we can. Don't get involved anymore. It's just not worth it.
You are loyal to your mother. Yes.
So these can be a bit much to keep track of. I've tried to give examples that I'll edit in that can kind of help show you what I mean by that. But if we can shorten it a bit, we can look at how one therapist specializing in family systems, Salvador Minuchin, it is 1 a.m. I really hope that's how you say it, Salvador Minuchin, framed the rules of a dysfunctional family, which he boiled down to 3 key mottos, all of which create resistance to change. 1 is don't talk. The family suppresses communication, further isolating themselves from each other until they essentially become estranged. This also results in suspicion and assumptions being made because no one really talks about how they feel, so you have to just make guesses. For example, if I never hear my godly parent express any remorse over something traumatic that happened to me, then he must not feel anything about it at all.
No best. I met your dad. Sorry. I didn't mean to. Why don't we ask her for help?
Grover, will you explain to your friend that he needs to pull himself together?
You can ask her, can you? When was the last time she talked to you?
Grover.
But the war can't continue.
Boy!
We're headed to Las Vegas to find your dad. What was that about?
You can't ask Luke about his dad.
Do you ever dream about Mom?
What you say? Oh, that you only meant well, 'cause you did.
2 is don't trust. Trust and vulnerability is minimized by family members breaking each other's trust. Duh.
Ares, Hades, Hermes de Tugarum.
But at least with the gods, you know the rules. Show them respect and they'll bring you corner no matter what.
3 is don't feel. Expressions of emotions when given are punished either emotionally or even physically to prevent emotional pain of the target of the emotional expression and to create an appearance of normalcy.
So you don't want to lie to your little friend? Too bad. I suggest you steer clear of him then.
How afraid of you do you think they'll be when your dad shows up looking to put you back in your place?
What you say?
Obviously, these rules don't build on very healthy values, and typically they exist in dysfunctional families to further discourage emotional authenticity and vulnerability. So the values of a dysfunctional family tend to be over-responsibility and perfectionism stemming from a fear of failure and abandonment. This is what the show calls inadequacy.
You aren't just a kid. This is how you show Athena your love. A monument to the power of perfection. We're soldiers on a mission. It's not a vacation.
Difficulty building trusting and intimate relationships.
Leah. She made me earn it.
Is that why you give me a hard time? I gotta earn it with you too?
Yeah, maybe.
She said this is what the gods are like to each other. This is the kind of family they are.
Do you know what that feels like? To be so close to someone you love, knowing neither of you has any choice but to keep hurting each other.
Toxic shame and a low sense of self-worth.
Do you think you cannot be replaced? There is too much at stake for you to fail me again.
Don't worry. Your dad had plenty of kids he stopped caring about once he lost interest. You'll have lots of company.
If Thalia were better at hers, there might not be a family of squirrels making her their home.
Self-destructive loyalty, which is defined as loyalty even when it comes at the cost of your own well-being.
You are loyal to your mother. Yes.
Achievement over feelings. Your achievements reflect your worth, which means that you value emotional earnesty less. It's more important in the family what you achieve. It's not so important to the family what you feel.
I hate kids. All of them. I hate my own kids. Maybe less than other kids, but still not fond of them. Look what I made. What are butterflies for my knee hurt? Ugh.
This is also what the show kind of redefines as chaos, that whole system.
Eat or be eaten. Power and glory and nothing else matters.
And finally, self-sufficiency at all costs.
We don't need help. We're fine. We were sent on a quest by the Oracle, by the gods. What do you think, it would be easy? It's supposed to be hard. That's why only certain people are chosen. If we clock in, we're basically saying it was a mistake to choose us.
If we want to look at some specific examples of how Camp Half-Blood functions as this kind of system with these rules, we can look at some of their customs at camp that they're expected to follow without second thought and see how these rules and values play out. We have the act of burnt offerings.
Burnt offerings. The gods like the smell, so it gets their attention before you say a prayer.
They like the smell of burnt mac and cheese.
I like the smell of baking.
In the books, campers are expected to scrape off the part of their meal that looks the best. And I feel like this idea already is very interesting to me, because when we think of children, typically food is something we place pretty high in terms of importance because they need it to grow and be healthy. And most parents would give up food if it meant that their children could eat. So when you consider that the gods don't actually even need sustenance themselves, they don't need to eat, they just like the smell of it, it's really interesting how that shows how conditional and uncaring they can be in their affection. In the show, however, it gets even darker, because here Luke tells us that it's the thing you'll miss the most that you have to burn so that the gods know that you're being serious, and then they'll listen. And this is wild to me because it's obviously kind of inhumane to demand sacrifice in order to be taken seriously and to be just listened to. But also because I feel like if I compare this to my own parents, I don't know if you can agree with this or relate to this, because my parents, to this day, even though I am an adult, will point out a part of a meal that they think that I should take because it looks the best. Which you would think that the person who cooked the meal would miss that part the most, or that they would want that part the most. But they still want me or my sister to have that part of the meal because we're their kids and we matter more than the meal. So the gods demanding sacrifice is a great signifier of how rigid and inhumane their rules are and how conditional they are as parents. Then we have capture the flag and going on quests. While quests in the show are highlighted as world-changing events and the most important thing you could ever do as a demigod, they are shown to be unglamorous and messy and dangerous and painful. But you're expected to perform well because the achievement is more important than how you might feel getting that achievement. There is, as far as we know, also no option to opt out of quests.
Because it ain't gonna be me.
Poseidon has claimed you. This is his will.
Poseidon has ignored me.
Or even capture the flag. Again, everything is conditional. If you want to be claimed, you have to prove it by winning capture the flag or doing some other kind of heroic deed. And if you want to be recognized and appreciated, then you have to succeed on a quest. Then we have Kleos, which I kind of already mentioned. I have a lot to say about Kleos, but for now, we'll just focus on the fact that the demigods are expected to gain Kleos, or glory, in order to reflect back on their parents in a positive way. Essentially, Kleos is just putting a name to that conditional system that they're in. But much like conditional and unhealthy family dynamics, there are no clear rules to gaining Kleos. We know this from the way that Luke's best strategy for helping Percy get some kind of glory is to just have him try everything and see what sticks. We also see it in Clarice. When I was watching the show way back when, in January, I didn't really know what to make of Clarice's behavior and her treatment of Percy. But I think the emphasis on her wanting Percy to admit that he's a fraud is meant to show how unfair the system is. And that Clarice here, beneath all that aggression, is maybe starting to doubt the fairness of the system.
I'm actually not interested in maiming or killing you, believe it or not. I just want you to admit you're a fraud. It'd make me feel better. Are you feeling up to that yet?
If a kid like Percy can show up and gain Kleos immediately by defeating the Minotaur, beating 3 older, more skilled campers, and then getting claimed in like 48 hours, then what exactly has her effort been going towards if she's gotten minimal rewards for it? When Percy breaks her spear, I don't think it's just her pride and her link to her father that breaks. I think it's also her worldview starting to crack open. But this is still early on, and maybe this is just me being delusional. I guess we'll know next season what they're gonna do with her. And then we have the cabins and the idea of getting claimed. When a new camper arrives, they're immediately placed in cabin 11. However, there are too many campers to provide proper sleeping arrangements for all of them, so some of them have to sleep on the floor with only a sleeping bag. I argue that in a more human and functional, healthy system, the camp, i.e. the gods, would allow for some renovations to cabin 11, besides the obvious solution of simply claiming their kids. But I digress. If the issue was solely to fit that many campers into one cabin, you would think that they would provide a second story to the cabin, like the one next to it has. You can see it has like a balcony or even a basement level, but we don't know if anyone has ever tried to suggest this. I feel like even though we don't know that, we can kind of assume that if someone tried to bring it up, it wouldn't be met with a whole lot of understanding. And then of course, even if you do get claimed, you have no real say in how your cabin looks, and you have no real say in how you live in that cabin. You're just expected to naturally like the same things as your parent. Camp Half-Blood and Olympus are both separated from the world, which makes it this like closed off system that I've kind of alluded to here. You can't enter or exit either place without explicit permission or an appointment. And I feel like we don't talk about that enough as like a fandom, that in order to visit a parent on Mount Olympus, you have to make an appointment. I feel like if you just remove that and like put it into the context of like a mortal child having to call and make an appointment with their parent in order to see them, we can immediately assume that that's not going to be a very healthy relationship, especially if you consider that a demigod is not getting that appointment. So besides the solstices, you have virtually no way of contacting or communicating with your godly parent. So campers are essentially locked in place, and if they're year-round campers, they have no way of seeing better alternatives for how a family might function.
This is a sacred valley, Percy. Humans can't see it, monsters can't enter it, the world can't touch it.
Which then makes sense if we look at Annabeth and Clarice, who are both implied to have arrived when they're pretty young. At least in the books, it's implied that Clarice is. Both girls are seemingly the most accepting of the system, and both of them enforce the rules, kind of like their parents would, onto other demigods around them. Despite not being very content within the system. They've presumably never been in a healthier system. We know Annabeth hasn't, and we can assume, given Clarice's behavior, that she probably has also never been in a healthier system. And if we look at Mount Olympus, we know that the gods themselves are also subjected to this kind of closed-off communication and denial. In Heroes of Olympus, Zeus shuts down communications completely, forbidding the gods from entering or exiting and reaching out to the mortal world. So it's not just demigods who are locked in place. I'm so awake, literally doing so well, and I'm not tired at all. You're tired. I'm not tired. I don't know what it means to be tired. Okay, lock in.
Isn't fair.
No, it isn't.
And I am failing.
Sally is so important to me as a character, and I think out of all of the characters in the show, she was actually the first one that I really enjoyed seeing the show explore in a different way to her book counterpart. Sally is admittedly very different in the show than she is in the books. In the books, Sally is first described by Percy as the following. Her name is Sally Jackson, and she is the best person in the world, which just proves my theory that the best people have the rottenest luck. Her own parents died in a plane crash when she was 5, and she was raised by an uncle who didn't care much about her. She wanted to be a novelist, so she spent high school working to save enough money for a college with a good creative writing program. Then her uncle got cancer, and she had to quit school her senior year to take care of him. After he died, she was left with no money, no family, and no diploma. The only good break she ever got was meeting my dad. Her eyes sparkle and change in the light. Her smile is as warm as a quilt. She's got a few gray streaks mixed in with her long brown hair, but I never think of her as old. When she looks at me, it's like she's seeing all the good things about me, none of the bad. I've never heard her raise her voice or say an unkind word to anyone, not even me or Gabe. My mom is the nicest lady in the world. And Percy is, of course, very biased and kind of childlike in his view of Sally, but it's not just that he sees her through a somewhat rose-colored lens that I dislike, or not dislike, but like less than the show. It's that in the books, it's all the way through to the newest books that Sally is seen by other characters in this way, as well as Percy. In Trials of Apollo, the Hidden Oracle, Lester Apollo, I have to call him that, sorry, Lester Apollo describes her as the following. Standing behind a counter making a smoothie was a strikingly attractive mortal woman of about 40. Her long brown hair had a few gray streaks, but her bright eyes, quick smile, and festive tie-dyed sundress made her look younger. I understood why Poseidon had been so smitten with her. Sally Jackson possessed just the right combination of compassion, strength, and beauty. She was one of those rare mortal women who could connect spiritually with a god as an equal, to be neither terrified of us nor greedy for what we can offer, but to provide us with true companionship. If I'd still been immortal, I might have flirted with her myself. You might hear those quotes and think, well, what's the problem with that? What's so bad about Sally being attractive and a good partner? What? Is it a crime to be the perfect mother? Yes! Kind of. If you're a fictional character who's supposed to have an arc and development, okay, maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it's still, hear me out. It's not that I dislike these quotes, and these are just the ones that I could think of off the top of my head, is that Sally herself is not the one saying them. We don't know if she considers herself to be the rare kind of mortal woman who can offer a god true companionship without being either terrified or greedy. And we don't know if she feels either young or old, or if she actually ever gets angry. She herself says very little. I mean, after 11 books of providing snacks and constantly cooking for Percy and other various house guests, she admits she likes food. I like food, muttered Meg. Sally laughed. Well, we have that in common. But we don't really get to see a ton of insight into her emotional life. We see a development of her character throughout the books, but it's very circumstantial, not very emotional. She goes from being stuck in an unhappy, abusive relationship to being alone but faring better, then starting her career as a novelist, and then she remarries and has another child. But what about her? What does she think about all this? We just don't get that much insight into her. And I understand why. It's first and foremost a story that started out as a bedtime story. And what kind of kid doesn't like the idea of a mom who never gets angry, always cooks, and has a smile as warm as a quilt? Sally is a somewhat romantic, very stereotypical 2000s kids media mom, but she's not very relatable. Because lots of parents cook, lots of parents are affectionate and safe. I argue that they should be. But I don't know a single parent who never loses their temper, who never gets mad, who doesn't struggle with their role and responsibility, especially when their kids themselves struggle. I don't know any parents like Sally Jackson besides other fictional parents. And if the show focuses on family and the complexities of family, then we should also allow Sally Jackson to be a little more complex. If the gods exist in the show as one system, then Sally represents a different alternative. And if we ask what good parenting is according to the show, and we compare the gods to her, I think it's clear that even though Poseidon never raises his voice at Percy or forces him to go to boarding school, Sally is the better parent. But I believe I started out this video by telling you that we can't just sit here and cross-compare the books to the adaptation, so let's take a closer look at what the show's text says about Sally specifically. Firstly, I would like to try and illustrate why I think that Sally's character is more effective in the show by doing a little creative exercise together, because I'm sure that sitting here and just listening to me talking has become a little tiring at this point, so we're going to do a fun little exercise if you want to. So, if you will, please close your eyes for a moment. I'd like you to imagine that you are the parent of a child. The parent. Maybe you're a single parent, maybe you're not. Either way, you have a child who you love, but who struggles with learning disabilities. You try your best to raise them, but you're not a perfect person, and you make mistakes, as all parents do. You'd like to think, despite the bumps in the road, that you're doing all right, even if it is really hard. So, about your kid, they love the Percy Jackson books, because they can see themselves in the main character, Percy. You think this is great, because anything that encourages your kid to read and learn about mythology and whatnot is wonderful. And now there's this new show out, based on the books, which you have never had the time to read, but your kid gets you to watch the show with them. You're excited to see a glimpse into this world that your kid worships. And then you meet Sally Jackson, not the one that we actually get in the show, but a different version of Sally, a book-accurate Sally Jackson. And Sally Jackson is the ideal mother. She is cooking, literally working in a candy shop. She always smells like candy. She's gentle and kind and never gets mad and never raises her voice. And she puts up with her frankly horrible husband. And yet she seems to manage exceedingly well for someone in your position. And you sit there, knowing your kid sees himself in Percy, in all the ways that they're alike. And you now have to wonder, is that what I'm supposed to be like? Are other parents like me like her? Is that what my kid wishes I was? So you can open your eyes now, by the way. If you did, close your eyes. And yeah, admittedly, that's kind of an over-exaggeration, but hopefully it helps my point still get across. Sally, as we see her in the show, with all her flaws and emotions and struggles, is more realistic because she's more relatable. Even if you're not a parent of a child with ADHD and dyslexia, you can probably still relate to her in some way. Because as Hermes says, space and time are easy, parenting is another thing entirely. And if we're focusing on the theme of family in the show and the complexities of family, are you tired of me saying that yet? And what exactly good parenting is, then Sally is a great example of exactly that. She's a good parent. And it's ironic because, in a way, Hermes and Poseidon's description of good parenting is sort of correct, but it's the principle of it and how it's employed by them versus Sally that makes a difference. Hermes defines parenting as
watching you struggle and feel powerless to stop it. But that sometimes that's what parenting is.
But if we look at what an article I found says about healthy parenting, especially in regards to unconditional love compared to conditional love, being a good parent is actually more about 1. Paying attention to your child fully without judging or interrupting them.
Is there something else you want to talk about?
Something happened to me, more than just my mind wandering, and it got worse.
2. Expressing affection every day. For example, through hugs, kisses, and words of encouragement.
It really wasn't my fault. It really wasn't my fault. Oh, what now? I'm sorry, I'm just very glad to see you.
3. Appreciating efforts and the journey rather than withholding praise until they succeed. As in, showing them that they are good enough while they're still trying, even if it takes time to improve or get what they want.
Hey, all that matters is that you're here, okay? And that I had enough time to pick up your welcome home gift.
Get what they want. 4. Supporting their dreams if they differ from yours, especially if they differ from what you'd hoped that they become.
I want him to know who he is before your family tries to tell him who they want him to be.
5. Setting boundaries that are loving, compassionate, and empathetic. Understanding and respecting individual differences.
If you really don't like it there, we can look for other options. I mean it.
6. Respecting them as you would any other grown-up individual. Just because a child is young doesn't mean that adults should disregard them, their opinions, or feelings.
He told me what he thinks happened with Nancy Bobofit. I told him I believe my kid. It was a real sure call. What makes you think that she was a monster?
7. Not comparing your child to others, especially siblings, and encouraging their individuality and unique traits.
For 15 minutes, please. Come on, just do it once with me.
And 8. Forgiving them and yourself and acknowledging and being honest about yours and their ability to make mistakes. Humanizing failure, not demonizing it.
You are not broken. You are singular. One day it could be really, really important, and I may not be there to help you.
And cast your votes. When do you think that I get to go to bed tonight? It's 2 a.m. Sally also has to step back here and there and allow Percy to struggle, but she never abandons him. She's always ready to come back, and we know that if it really came down to it, she would come to get him. Because while the gods function in a very rigid and dysfunctional system, where discussions aren't really allowed and contact is seen as cheating and favoritism, Sally does not abide by that same set of rules. Sally takes call after call from Percy the night after she drops him off at school, and she hears him out when he complains that it's awful and he wants to go home. She emphasizes the importance of Percy being there and being her son, not his failures. But she also knows when to step back. She lets Percy go to Camp Half-Blood when the time is right. And before that, she sends Percy away to school in order to maintain a level of safety, even though it's torture for both of them. I think Sally works not just as a means for parents to relate to the story, but also for us grown-up kids to maybe understand our parents' point of view a little bit better. I have had many scenes like the car flashback and the cafe play out in my own childhood, but I rarely considered how my parents were feeling in those moments. Because obviously they weren't thrilled either when they were having to send me away to things or push my boundaries a little bit, because they were genuinely just trying to do the right thing. It's not that they didn't want me to be comfortable, they just didn't want to coddle me. I don't have any kids. I think that balance between when am I respecting your boundaries, when am I coddling you, is a very big internal conflict, like a very big question that a lot of parents have to face. Parenting is sometimes standing back and letting your kid figure out their own problems. But in order for that strategy to work out, you have to provide an unconditionally loving background first. You have to establish a safety net so that if they struggle and lose their balance, you can catch them. That's what parenting is. Further than just being relatable to us and to our parents, the show manages to cram in so much internal but relatable conflict into Sally's character in only very short moments. Every flashback with her and Percy threatens to choke me up, even now after having rewatched it a million times. If anything, it's only gotten worse the more I've rewatched it. Because if there's one thing that the show and the book definitely agrees on, it's that Sally just loves her kid so much. And in a weird reverse of the show's critique, I would like to take a moment to argue that the books actually don't do a very good job of showing us how hard Sally's job is as a parent and how much she struggles with it, and rather the books just tell us all about it. Her backstory is fed to us in a couple of pages from Percy. We never see the abuse that we know she's been experiencing, and we never actually see how hard it's been for her while raising Percy. But the show actually shows us how hard it was. We see her struggle with prejudice and judgment from other parents and from schools. We see her argue with Gabe, and sure, even if it's not as scary of an argument as it is in the book, it is nevertheless shown on screen that these two don't get along. I remember seeing someone mention that it didn't feel like it was that impactful of a conflict between her and Gabe, because it just seemed like another argument that they were having, like this happened all the time. And I feel like that's kind of the point. They argue all the time. But never mind that. We also see her own internal judgment. She's not as forgiving with herself as she is with others. She says, quite literally, I am failing. And we just feel her pain when she tries to keep Percy both close and safe, which we know is an impossible task. And for what it's worth, I think it's a surface level and very emotionally immature take that her actions in the show mean that she is a bad parent as well. Because I have seen people argue that. Because the surface level reading of the show is to just look at the actions of the characters, not the motivations behind them. And if you look at all of Sally's actions in the show, you can feel that fear is the underlying motivator for all of the decisions that she makes. She is at sea. She is the mom in the story that she tells Percy at the start of the show. And she's trying to brave the storm that's meant to break both of them. She's terrified of losing Percy. In the car, before they go inside Percy's new school in the flashback, she quotes The Wizard of Oz.
Well, we're not in Kansas anymore. I meant we are only an hour from the city and it feels like we're on a different planet.
Sally, get behind me. She feels like she's in an alien world because it's quiet, it's calm. And yeah, I know that she's from New York, so obviously she's going to notice that it's quiet there. I think it's more about the fact that it's peaceful and that there's no chaos, no immediate threats, and no Gabe, for that matter. When she loses her temper with Percy and then gets angry at the principal, we have to remember that in those moments, we are seeing it from Percy's point of view. But if we start the flashback scene, we immediately see Sally and we see her visible discomfort. From Percy's point of view, however, it's going to seem unfair and irrational. To Percy, being forced to go to these boarding schools feels like a betrayal. But to Sally, it's quite literally the only way she can keep Percy around, which only makes Percy's dialogue hit harder when he asks why she's so desperate to get rid of him, because he would never do that to her. But I do wonder, knowing what Percy knows at the end of the season, if he still would think that way, because I don't think he would. I think he knows in that moment why Sally did the things that she did. I think that's why he thinks back to that moment after talking to Hermes, because all of a sudden he understands that, yeah, what she was doing was hurting him, but what he was doing was also hurting her, because she did have the right motivations for those actions. She wasn't just doing it for no good reason. And after all, maybe Sally wasn't so eager to get rid of him as he thought, because at least, even though she was powerless and desperate, she still promised to come and pick him up if he really truly hated the school, even though that would have been dangerous for him. Then in the swimming flashback, we see her freak out entirely, and it might seem a little silly, but she needs Percy to be prepared. Generally, her whole thing in the show is that she's been preparing Percy as best as she can, because she's scared. In the books, she doesn't teach Percy Greek. Annabeth does at camp. She doesn't tell him Greek myths. Chiron does. And that makes no sense if you ask me. What kind of caring parent wouldn't try and prepare their demigod child as much as possible? Who wouldn't get swimming lessons for them and teach them about the myths, knowing that one day they would have to face these creatures and characters in real life? Sally here is not the perfect mom. She loses her temper at Percy, she cries, she gets frustrated and yells back at Gabe, but she's real and she's relatable. And she has agency and a voice, which is something that I really wish the books could have given Sally more of. As a closing statement for Sally, I would like to bring up a piece of critique that often gets given to another character in the show that I don't have time to talk about, but who also changed in the show, which is Hades. When people are being nice about Hades. When people are being nice about his characterization in the show, they tend to say that they believe this version of Hades, being the father of Nico, makes a lot more sense. And I would like to extend that argument to Sally. I believe that Sally in the show is the mother of Percy Jackson a lot more than I believe it in the books. That's not to say that I don't believe it in the books. I like Sally's character just fine in the books, but I feel like in the show, I can see that similarity between them. I can see where Percy gets his, his sort of attitude from, and his gung-ho and confidence and his sass and humor. I can see that in Sally, so it makes sense that Percy has those qualities as well. So that's Sally. I guess that means we have to talk about Gabe now.
Understand things.
Where's
like...
my mom?
I don't know. I don't know where your mom is. I'm not Nostradamus.
Oh, Gabe. I bet you didn't know how important you were to the fans, huh? If there's one character in the show who got a weird amount of attention after the show started airing, it's Gabriel Ugliano, or Smelly Gabe, to use his full legal name. So the critique surrounding Gabe pretty much boils down to one thing. This guy isn't bad enough. But objection, Your Honor. What on earth does that mean? We have to talk about For some reason, Gabe became a huge point of discussion when the show came out. Out of all the critiques I've seen, Gabe came up the most, and usually with the same points being made, that he wasn't bad enough. And I take issue with this stance for several reasons. First of all, I understand that from a purely comparative standpoint, Gabe in the show is not as bad as Gabe is in the books. Gabe in the books is physically abusive. He's a lot more antagonistic towards Percy, and overall feels a lot scarier. He says on page 31 of The Lightning Thief, Somebody expects to live under this roof. He ought to carry his own weight. Isn't that right, Eddie?
Which is much more reminiscent of the gods' way of parenting. He's also described as...
He managed the electronics megamart, but he stayed home most of the time. I don't know how he wasn't fired sooner. He just kept collecting paychecks, spending the money on cigars that made me nauseous, and on beer, of course. Always beer. When I was home, he expected me to provide his gambling funds. He called it our guy secret, meaning if I told my mom, he'd punch my lights out.
But Gabe doesn't have to be that way to fulfill his purpose to the story. People tend to bring up the physical abuse revealed at the end of the book as an important, if not the most important, aspect of his character. As if we can't remove that plot point and still feel incredibly negatively towards Gabe. The thing about domestic abuse is that it is a pretty heavy topic. It's a very real topic. It's a topic that requires a level of delicacy and, especially in a children's show, a bit more screen time than I think Percy Jackson could afford to give it in order to treat it with enough respect and gravity. Without the appropriate amount of screen time, the moment becomes a throwaway line meant to add some last-minute shock factor and make us really root for Gabe's death, which is the second point of contention that people tend to bring up of his character. Actually, I forgot to say something. And unfortunately, I do feel like the book kind of does treat that moment that way. I know why. It's not like a huge critique of the book, but in comparison, it would have felt strange, I think, in the show if they had kept that part in. Which is, of course, the second point of contention that people tend to bring up when it comes to Gabe's character, which is that if Gabe isn't bad enough, then he doesn't deserve to die, and so there's no point to his death at the end. I, again, disagree deeply with that statement. Firstly, I think it's a pretty childish viewpoint in the first place to assume that someone deserves to die simply because they're a bad person. I don't actually think that Gabe in the book deserves to be murdered, locked out and kicked out of the family, definitely. But murder, not so much. Funnily enough, not something I condone. Obviously, he's a fictional character, so who cares? But it is treated as fair in the book because it's a children's book with a very 10 to 12-year-old mentality where monsters deserve to be turned into dust for a while and bad step-parents deserve to die. But if the show is trying to look at things from a more nuanced, balanced perspective, then killing Gabe at the end really doesn't do it any favors. Besides, Gabe getting himself killed by being a bad step-parent makes perfect sense to me. He oversteps boundaries, he exhibits hubris in its purest form, and he's immediately punished for it.
It's very Greek.
Gabe doesn't have to be that bad for him to serve as a valuable character in the show. In fact, he doesn't have to be bad at all for Sally to not want to be with him. I think it's a pretty small-minded assumption that relationships are so black and white that there exists some kind of clear line that a person must cross in order to become a bad partner. However, this is still Gabe, and this is still Percy Jackson and not Bluey, so we should note that Gabe, for all intents and purposes, is still obviously framed in the show as a bad person and a bad partner. Our first introduction to him in the show is actually through audio. We hear him argue with Eddie the custodian, and it's a very childish argument where Gabe is basically just Uno reversing everything that Eddie says. Then Eddie exits and tells Percy,
I'm walking out. You're walking in. I should be apologizing to you.
Room, which is something that people famously say when you're about to go in and meet a really nice person in the next room. And when we finally see Gabe, he is pretty much framed as much as a deadbeat stepdad as Disney policies would allow before they have to draw a cartoonishly large neon arrow above him with a sign that says, "Bad guy." I mean, look at this. Look at this. I'm obsessed with this shot. It's perfect. If we compare it to the book, we have this description to cross-reference with. The television was blaring, chips and beer cans were strewn all over the carpet. I feel like the show pretty much captures this, and the rest is more in spirit. For example, we have the interesting choice of the poker table sitting behind Gabe, like a Gloria of bad vibes, And the rest of the apartment is, interestingly enough, cozy. It's a little messy or a lift-in, but it's not a mess, you know? And then there's Gabe with his trash spreading out around him like a growing infection. He's unkempt in appearance, he's wearing socks and slippers, which is something only an evil person would do, and he looks incredibly out of place here, because he doesn't belong here. He's not meant to be here, but he is. His physical appearance is actually interesting to me, because first of all, it does a very important thing to undo this very unfortunate tendency in children's books, where evil and bad characters are described as physically unattractive and overweight. And Gabe in the books is described like that. Percy calls him a tuskless walrus. But you can't say that. Oh god, it's so late. I'm losing it. But it also ties into that don't judge a book by its cover theme by Gabe kind of just being an average dude who really just needs some better clothes and a haircut. Like, he's not ugly, I wouldn't say. In fact, he kind of looks like a knockoff version of Poseidon. Like, they wear a similar color of shirt. They both wear these like loose pants. Obviously Poseidon wears like these like hemp sailor beach boy. Beach boy. I don't even know what that means. Like Australian. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's like a surfer. Like pants. And Gabe obviously wears like the classic generic gray sweatpants. And they both wear this like necklace. Their hair is sort of similar. Like, they look similar. They could be cousins. Distant cousins. But cousins. And I feel like that's pretty interesting because I don't know how intentional it is that he looks like that. But it is funny if they went for like, we have Poseidon at home vibes. I feel like they achieved that. The TV is not blaring, but it is on. You can imagine that when the sound is on, that it's very, very annoying. Also, as a side note, because I spent so long trying to find a good screen cap of it, they did, as far as I can tell, fun fact, make up a fake beer for Gabe called Shots with a C or a Z, because it's not just a normal beer, it's a cool beer. And it's actually not just beer, it's a malt lager. It says like in tiny print at the bottom. It's not important that you know that, but it's important to me that you know that, so I didn't waste my time for half an hour looking at beer cans to try and figure out what it is. But let's not focus on the framing the show uses alone. Let's also talk a little bit about him as a character. So if we revert to the family systems part of the video, you'll remember that unhealthy systems are built with these rigid, closed, and sort of inhumane rules, which at best discourages family members from speaking up against mistreatment from the rule-maker of the family, and at worst forbids them from speaking up or punishes them for doing so. In simple terms, this means that someone raised within an abusive, violent system, or just an unsafe environment in general, will be very unlikely to speak up for themselves. If you look at how being raised with conditional versus unconditional love, for example, being raised with unconditional love strengthens your self-confidence and your self-esteem, and also your moral compass and your ability to confront issues and problem solve. And if you're raised with conditional love, like you are Camp Half-Blood, then you would be less likely to speak up for yourself because you would lack self-esteem and self-confidence. You would therefore not have very good problem-solving skills, so on and so forth. And all of that is basically just to say that if you're raised in that way, you probably wouldn't speak up against your shitty stepdad. Statistically speaking, you would be less likely to do so. You'll want to, and Percy in the books does want to speak up against Gabe.
Maybe if the kid apologizes for interrupting my poker game. Maybe if I kick you in your soft spot, I thought, and make you sing soprano for a week. But my mom's eyes warned me not to make him mad. Why did you put up with this guy? I wanted to scream. Why did you care what he thought? I'm sorry, I muttered.
Because Book Percy comes from a closed system. He is not able to speak his truth because Gabe controls the family by being manipulative and having the fiscal upper hand, I guess, as the breadwinner of the family. Again, I feel like it's a good idea that they changed that because how? He doesn't even go to work in the book. He just stays home. Okay, whatever. Okay, yeah, but like Gabe in the show is like really not that scary. So he's like really not like abusive enough. Like, obviously I don't want him to be abusive, but like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of sentiment that I just expertly acted out, by the way, you're welcome, is a sentiment that I heard way too many times when I was researching for the earliest concept of this video. And ooh, it pisses me off. Because first of all, yes, you are asking him to be more abusive. You are literally saying that by saying that he's not bad enough. Because if you want him to be worse than he is, then he would just become abusive. And I've seen some people try to argue back against that by saying that we don't necessarily know if he's physically abusive or not. Given that they cut the reveal of him being abusive, I think we can assume in this version that he is not physically violent. But that is not to say that he's a good partner for that reason. We can still see that he's a mess. He doesn't help to clean the apartment or even the area that he sits in. We see the beer cans and the takeaway trash around him, and we know that he's playing imaginary poker online, so we could very well assume that maybe he has a drinking problem or a gambling problem. In terms of his dialogue, he's condescending, snarky, and pretty much useless to Percy. And with Sally, he's inconsiderate and equally incompetent.
As soon as I got off the phone with Yancey.
Who's Yancey?
The school. But if you make this miserable, I'm gonna go anyway, and then I'm gonna eat my sandwich and yours while I listen to the game on the radio.
You know I hate watching the Knicks alone.
So do I.
And Gabe says, you know I hate watching the Knicks alone, and Sally replies, so do I. Which means that he isn't, considering her feelings in the situation, he's only thinking about himself. And when Sally says that her and Percy, or Percy and her, are going to Montauk, he asks, why am I okay with this? So he's very selfish and very, emotionally unaware. The conversation between Percy and Gabe, however, is probably the most crucial moment with Gabe in order to support my point that Gabe needs to be this way in order to set Percy up to be a better pattern breaker. Because Gabe is not a healthy role model, we know this, but it's actually crucial that he's not scary. Percy's family at home has to be the opposite of the system we see at Camp Half-Blood and on Olympus in order for Percy to be able to identify how wrong it is in the first place. We need him to come from an open, functional system. And here he does. I mentioned that in the books, Percy only thinks about answering Gabe, but he can't because he'll get his lights punched out. But in the show, we can see that they have an open, albeit not that healthy, communication system. Actually, for Gabe, it's maybe a little too open, since he openly admits to answering Sally's phone.
You answer Mom's cell?
I answer whatever's ringing.
The difference is in the fact that Percy can talk back to Gabe without fear of what's going to happen. I saw a few people say that they disliked that Percy didn't seem afraid of Gabe, but instead just seemed kind of annoyed at Gabe. But that's again kind of the point, that Percy has been raised to believe that even if the adults are incompetent and mean, they still have to listen to what you have to say. And this allows Percy to speak freely with other authority figures, contrasting the other demigods who can't or immediately back down when challenged. If we compare Percy to Grover and Annabeth, Annabeth never speaks out against the gods until the Hephaestus scene, but besides that, she never argues with authority. I guess you could argue that maybe she has a bit of a sass back and forth with Ares. It's not quite the same as what Percy does. Plus, at that point, she's been under the influence of Percy for long enough that he's starting to rub off on her, but that's besides the point. And after the Hephaestus and Ares moment, she still insists on being respectful and honoring the gods. Grover is not really a demigod, but he is placed into an interesting family dynamic of sorts in the show, where he is the kid, Mr. D is the father figure, and then the wood nymph Helena that we briefly see in episode 2 is the mother figure. When Grover first gets to camp, He expresses that something still doesn't feel right to Mr. D, who tells him he did his job, what else is there to do? When Grover starts to speak again, Mr. D sends him a very stern glare and Grover shuts up. Then, after receiving some encouragement from Helena, Grover meets with the Council of Cloven Elders and, feeling justified, he returns to Mr. D and Chiron to plead his case. But he gets shot down immediately again. Mr. D tells Grover, "So you don't want to lie to your little friend? Too bad, because the family business with the war and all is more important than Grover's personal moral compass and feelings." Accomplishment valued over feelings, as we have discussed, is a telltale sign of an unhealthy dynamic. And here, Grover disobeys the order and he tells Percy the truth anyway. Despite the fact that Grover in that scene is technically doing Chiron and Mr. D a favor by convincing Percy to take the quest, because he tells him about his mom, he still gets punished for it. And if the other demigods observe this trend where speaking up for themselves and sticking by their morals equals getting punished, it's not surprising that none of them seem to know how to stand up for themselves in a healthy way. And then there's Percy, who comes from this open system of the story, and so he immediately stands up for himself constantly.
You really don't want to start with this guy. He's starting with me. Your family is a mess. I can't give it to you. We've run across a few monsters like you, and we've sent them all packing. If you aren't careful, you're gonna find out.
These statements are not going to come from someone who was raised to be afraid of authorities. They come from kids who grew up feeling secure and loved unconditionally enough that they have the self-esteem to say these things. Percy is able to break the pattern because he's not dependent on it. He doesn't need to go on quests, earn glory, or become immortal. He doesn't have the need to prove himself because he's been raised to know that he has inherent worth by being himself. And in order to give him that very necessary change, we need his parents to change. And so they do. And so Gabe is no longer terrifying. Instead, he becomes somewhat of a training dummy for Percy. Someone who tries to go against him, but isn't so scary that Percy can't handle it. And to be completely honest, Gabe is more entertaining this way. We get plenty of unhealthy, toxic parents in this series. I don't think we need Gabe to be one of them for it to work. Oh my god, okay. Pushing through.
Did you just... I don't know. Maybe figuring this out as I go.
So Percy was the hardest for me to write the script for, so I've decided to just kind of make a list. That seems to be the way here. Percy knowing more about the mythological world in the show, if you ask me, makes a lot of sense. Fish out of water characters can get really, really boring, really, really fast. So to have Percy be a bit more prepared feels like a good call. As much as people argue that these kids shouldn't know these things right away in order to install a better tension and sense of fear, I feel like it's arguably weirder if they don't know at all and if they're as naive as they are in the books. Because while Percy is new to the world, but let's not forget that in the book he does learn quite a bit from Chiron and Annabeth in the book. We have page 107 in The Lightning Thief and also page 5 where Percy literally recites the entire Kronos myth. Ergo, he always knew who Kronos was. But even with that said, Medusa is a pretty standard myth, I would argue. It's pretty entry level, so of course these kids are gonna know who she is. But I digress. I guess I have to admit, it is really annoying that the show doesn't give any kind of explanation as to why or how these kids know all these things. Oh, wait.
Your mother taught you ancient Greek.
My mom used to tell me her story. My mom never talked about my dad that way.
My grandpa Kronos, 8. Yeah. Then my dad made him puke them back up, then chopped him into a million pieces and chucked him into a bottomless pit. So that kind of sent the toad right out of the gate.
I gave you the tools to steal the Masterworld, only to watch it taken from you.
Right. So they do kind of give an explanation as to how Percy knows these things. But the biggest how do you know this moment is arguably Krusty. So let's run through it really quickly because I would like to go to bed today. So in the scene, Percy walks in and basically goes, "I know what you are." And Krusty's like, "Okay." And then Percy says now, and Annabeth, who was invisible, pushes Krusty onto the bed and they trap him there. No head getting chopped off because this is a Disney show. Do I want to talk about it? Do I even have time to talk about it? Okay, a side note about the head getting chopped off, I guess. When people talk about this, like lack of violence or whatever, and especially when it comes to Krusty, usually they bring up Gravity Falls as an example of a kid show that can tell a story in only 2 seasons with 24 episodes per season and still manages to have very dark themes. Excuse me one second. Dark themes and like more grotesque moments, like they have body horror and whatnot. But I don't think that we can really compare the two, because sure, Gravity Falls has body horror and someone getting beheaded. It's a wax statue, but still. But those are not the same as seeing something happen in real life. When we read a book, we can sort of screen how gory we want something to be. So that description of Krusty getting his head chopped off is, we can choose how much blood we want there to be and whatnot. In a live action depiction, we don't get to control that. So it's not really the same thing. And even if it isn't an animated show, it's kind of the same thing. Like, we understand that it's not real. And like Gravity Falls especially has such a cartoony art style that like you really can't say that that's the same thing as like watching this guy get his head off on camera. Besides, as far as the like 2 seasons thing, as a really quick side note, I don't think that that's comparable either, because Gravity Falls was written episode to episode, and they knew how many episodes they had. They knew that they were getting 2 seasons. It's not the same as adapting a book into 8 episodes, which is not really something the show could control. Also, I don't really care about Krusty enough to deduct points from the show because they didn't include that. I feel like he's one of the moments that, frankly, if they just cut him entirely, I wouldn't have thought that much about it. But maybe that's personal taste. Oh, right, I never explained that with the Krusty scene. So the reason that I think it's confusing and why it seems like they just like randomly know everything is because they don't really do a good job of explaining that they just move the plot point in the book where they plan for what they're going to do when they get into DOA records. They kind of just move that plot point to Krusty instead, where it's implied that they already formulated a plan beforehand. That's why Annabeth is there to push him onto the bed. Like, the reason that Percy walks in and goes, "I know what you are," isn't because he's just like randomly sidekick all of a sudden and he's just like a mini Sherlock Holmes. It's because Annabeth has already told him, and probably also Grover has told him, who Krusty is, because he's running out of time. He doesn't have time. He needs to get going. So he needs to just kind of get this whole interaction over with. Come see, come saw. My next point for Percy is that I think the show does a better job of setting up Percy's development and his arc than the books do. The books were written book to book when Rick, sorry, can I call him Rick? I think I already did. Started writing the series. He didn't know that he was going to write 5 books, so he kind of just made up the story as he went along, and if you read the books, you can definitely tell the development kind of flip-flops between books. And personally, I think that that adds to the charm of the books, that they themselves are sort of ADHD coded. It's very relatable. But I don't want that in a show. I think if a TV show has that level of inconsistency between character development and world building, it gets noticed a lot more because, again, it's visual and we will remember that better than we will remember a bunch of words on pages. So for the show, I think that it's one of the stronger points of it being an adaptation, that it can see all 5 books and it can see where every character ends up and try to sort of line that up in a way that feels more consistent and more streamlined for each character. And I think it's safe to say that the writers probably were expecting to do at least 2 seasons, just based off of how hyped up the show was. I feel like everyone kind of knew that it was going to do well enough to get at least another season. And I feel like it makes sense that they would then plan for it, even if they couldn't actively plan for it. They would probably still be thinking about it. And why not stretch Percy's arc a little? Why not have him start out differently than Percy we know in the books? Why not have him develop into that Percy instead of just having him immediately be like we remember him to be? If we stretch out that arc a little bit, we can add more weight and rhythm to it, because arguably I don't feel like the books do a very good job of giving him an arc. He doesn't really change very much from the Lightning Thief to the Chalice of the Gods. He's very much the same character. And that's fine, but I feel like it makes sense that the show would try and do it a little differently just to see if they could. And sometimes people will complain that Percy in the show lacks development and an arc, and I feel like that's really confusing because he has a very clear arc to me. Like, he develops very obviously. In the show, he goes from being confused, lonely, and unsure of his place in the world. Then he learns who he is, he struggles with that, and then goes on a quest, returning to find that he has made real friends, understands the world around him, and accepts his position in the world as a demigod. That's an arc. I don't know, maybe people missed it. So if we compare that to the books, we have to address the fandom development. In the fandom, people generally tend to think of Percy's internal arc and development in relation to Luke, which I think makes sense. I agree that they are very tied to each other, they're parallels to each other. However, the general opinion seems to be that Percy goes from idolizing Luke to hating him to finally coming full circle and sympathizing with him. As he becomes more and more of a pawn to the gods and gets dragged into more and more dangerous situations, Percy starts to wonder if maybe Luke was right. Not fully, as in like, oh, I'm going to start another civil war, but like he starts to sympathize with him. But that's not really how it plays out in the books. In reality, Percy, on page 108 of The Lightning Thief, says,
I began to understand Luke's bitterness and the way he seemed to resent his father. Okay, so maybe the gods had important things to do, but couldn't they call once in a while?
So if we're aiming to give Percy a more consistent and rhythmically satisfying arc, it would make sense to drag out that realization a little bit and to have Percy sympathize with Luke for longer. Which was always more of an undercurrent in the books, is that the family is messed up, not that Luke is messed up. He knows that it's not really about bringing back the golden age, it's about setting something right. And I think the show version of Percy is more ready to confront and demand that change. In The Last Olympian, the book, obviously, he only gets the idea to ask the gods for this change at the very last minute. He promises Luke that he won't let the unclaimed be ignored again, but he doesn't mention that promise again until he is offered immortality and he looks at Annabeth, remembers his friends who have died, and then knows what to do, which implies that he wasn't really thinking that much about what he was going to do. I don't know if it's mean to say, I just feel like it gives me the impression that like he kind of just said it and like, you're dying, like what am I supposed to say? Am I supposed to just say no? Obviously, I'm going to say, yeah, I won't let it happen again. But what do you want me to do? In the show, Percy delivers his speech in episode 8 to Zeus, almost like his own prophecy. And because the gods aren't willing to listen yet, they haven't learned their lesson, it comes true. And the family remains a mess, and Kronos gains power, which I'm sure we'll see the gods struggle with in future seasons, just like Percy predicts here. And then, after it's all over, I think Percy, in season 5, will have the ability to point around him just like Zeus can and see and say, well, look what happened. I told you this would happen, so maybe now you should consider changing. Either way, I am interested in how the show will deal with this more compassionate side of Percy and his arc throughout all of the seasons. My point is just to give the show a little slack for now, because unless he remains unchanged in all 5 seasons, I don't think we can really judge if the show succeeds in bringing his arc to the screen yet. So, finally, I want to talk about how Percy in the show is more realistic and he's more grounded and likable, and that's because he's less violent and black and white in his morality. Percy in the show is introduced to us as being more open-minded and understanding that he can't make quick assumptions about anything. It starts with a shift in his mindset. If we look back to the first flashback we get with him and Sally, I think this scene shows the difference in mentality between book Percy and the more mature mentality of show Percy. When asked why he thinks Perseus is a hero, Percy replies, because he kills monsters, which I think is very much in line with book Percy. And Sally gently sets him straight. It's not that easy. You can't just assume that everyone that looks like a monster is bad and vice versa. As I mentioned earlier, Percy can't read his assignment in the Met when he's supposed to pick a god and describe how he sees them and how they make him feel. He can't use any context clues on the page that he's given to figure out what he sees, so he remembers what his mom taught him. Because family is where we learn how to judge the world around us. But Sally doesn't just force ideals over Percy's head like the gods would. She actively engages his understanding by questioning what makes him think the way that he thinks. She doesn't stand there and say, and here's Medusa, she's a monster, she was bad. Remember, if you come across someone like her, you have to kill her immediately. In fact, when she later in the same episode turns Percy over to Grover's care, when they say goodbye, she gets cut off. But she is trying to say to Percy, remember the stories I told you, especially the ones that they'll... And then she gets cut off.
Remember what I taught you. Remember the stories I told you, especially the stories they will tell you. No.
But I think, given what she says in episode 7, what she's trying to say here is remember the stories I told you, especially the ones that they'll try to change or disregard. She gently, almost philosophically, engages in a dialogue with him to teach him that there is no specific ideal he should believe. He has to make up his own mind by considering all sides first. If we compare this to his mentality in the books, we can see a stark contrast in how compassionate Percy is as a hero. On page 282 of The Lightning Thief, he says,
I had no qualms about what I had to do. If Krusty was human, I couldn't hurt him anyway. And if he was a monster, he deserved to be turned to dust for a while.
And in episode 3 of the show, he says, so, you're not a monster. What are you then? Must be a little more to it than that. Percy in the show hears people out. He doesn't assume immediately. Percy in the books very much does. In the books, Percy quickly adopts the mindset of other demigods, which isn't inherently a deficit to his character, but it does make him less prepared to break out of that mindset. If Percy already, before he gets to camp, knows who he is and what he believes is right, then it becomes a conflict of whether or not he should adopt the mindset or not. Does he stick with his principles or abandon them? Does he even really have a choice? I don't know where the show will take his arc fully, but I can assume, given the discussion that the first season has brought to his character, that it will be something along the lines of becoming a hero at the cost of his humanity.
It's very Greek.
I imagine that in season 5, Percy will not just give up immortality because he wants to be 16 with Annabeth and have a normal coming of age, but also because he symbolically wants to be tied to Sally's world, the human, mortal world. And I think in order to achieve a satisfying ending with that choice, we have to see Percy sort of weave between the two worlds and feel pulled and tempted by both of them.
I told you I don't think Luke wants to kill me.
I don't think he does either. That's what scares me. When Luke explained why he planned to take down Olympus, part of it made sense to you, didn't it? Luke knows.
I'm sure that people would argue that the books also do a good job of showing that, but I don't think that they go into that concept as much as they could have. The books pretty much have Percy accept that he's a demigod immediately, and then from then on we see him belong to that world almost completely. We see him less and less in the human world without mythological elements. Maybe the show won't go into that divide at all, and this is all wishful thinking, but I'd love to see it try, because it is a visual medium, so it can play on things like color and symbolism in ways that the books maybe can't. And especially because the books are first person and tied to Percy's point of view, I would love to see how the show would treat him as more of a third person point of view. I'll edit this together and So as we just discussed, Percy is introduced to us in the show by being more open-minded and understanding that he can't make quick assumptions about anything. He's less violent, sure, he still goes to shove Nancy, but besides that, he's not as much of an instigator of violence as he is in the books, where he does a lot of stupid things knowingly because he's just really impulsive. On page 164 of The Lightning Thief, he, for example, says, "What I did next was so impulsive and dangerous, I should have been named ADHD Poster Child of the Year." And while he might seem less badass to those who only care about spectacle and action, Percy is actually subverting expectations, in my opinion, by being less of that classic superhero character. Here, he's a very believable 12-year-old boy. Again, I don't want him to start out as a full-fledged Hercules. I don't want him to be overpowered from day one, because if you start a character there, then it's a very naive assumption that you can keep turning up the notch of the power and have it not just fall flat and become repetitive and predictable. It's not as fun if you don't get to see him grow or struggle at all. And also just have a little faith, you know? Like, I feel like I already said this, but truly, if we get all 5 seasons, we can discuss this further. I obviously am at a disadvantage here because I only have 1 season to work with, so I can only assume that that's where the show is going to go. I don't know, though. So, if the show gets to season 5 and we don't see any change in his character then we can discuss that as a deficit to the show overall and its ability to understand Percy. But for now, I don't think we can really judge any aspect of any character fully because they're not in their final form yet, you know? So back to this lack of violence though, I really like what it brings to his character because I like a hero that actually tries to get the scope of the situation before he pulls his weapon. And since people love to compare the book and the show so much, let's look at how book Percy thinks versus the show.
You want to gargle with toilet water again, Clarice? Close your mouth.
What doesn't make sense to you? The way you guys all talk. The way the gods want us to think. Gotta burn an offering to get a parent's attention. Gotta beat up on Clarice just to get my father to admit he's my father.
It makes me sad, Percy. What does? That you signed me up for this stupid quest?
Really? Because of me? It's okay. We're gonna be okay.
I'm going to kill her.
So you're not a monster, what are you then?
A survivor.
You must be a little more than that.
Oh, I forgot. Annabeth will have a plan all figured out.
You're better at this than me. You just are. And you know it. Believe me, I wish there was another way this quest succeeds. I just don't see it.
He's understanding and caring, and he still fights back, but he doesn't instigate violence, and he's not as much of a danger to others as he is in the books, because it's also less of a stereotypical depiction of ADHD in boys. And I think this is unintentional, but it does also work better for our current social climate where more and more young boys and men are turned towards violence and impulsive behavior. I think it's good that Percy, who could very much be a role model to boys that age, isn't like that. And finally, as I mentioned, children who come from closed, unhealthy systems typically don't know how to break out of them or even recognize them. Annabeth is proof of that concept in the show. It's not until she meets Percy, who shows her a different alternative to a reality, that she begins to realize that it is wrong, the system that she's in, and that she actually does want to be different. Percy is essentially in Annabeth's shoes. He comes from an unhealthy system, more than he does in the show, and that should make him unable to speak up against authorities. And it does, until he's pushed over the edge, and then he genuinely does become irrational and violent. Before that point, he chooses to stay silent when mistreated because he fears punishment. On page 35 in The Lightning Thief, he mentions that if he told his mom about Gabe taking money from him, he would get his lights punched out. So Percy in the book comes from a much more unhealthy system, and that reflects in his conversation with Zeus and Poseidon in the book. In the book, Percy is much more respectful when he talks to them because he knows the consequences it could have, and he doesn't pretend that they'll listen to him. He knows it's probably no use. But I stopped myself. Arguing would do no good. It would very possibly anger the only god on my side. If we compare that to the same scene in the show, we have Percy showcasing the ultimate open system mentality.
The war proceeds. It ends with victory. You escape with your life. That is your prize. Where did you think that you and I would negotiate?
I thought you might listen.
Percy comes from an open system in the show. He's used to being argued with, and he knows that arguing comes from being heard. He assumes that adults will listen to him, even if they disagree with what he has to say. And that is the marker of an open system, even if it's not the healthy system that Gabe presents to him. We'll discuss more of Percy's ability to confront the internal problems in the family later.
Maybe I was that way once. I don't want to be that way anymore. I won't be like all of you. I just won't.
In our Olympian family system, everything is conditional. It's not fair and it's not right. But as it is, you cannot simply exist within the system and expect to be treated as worthy of anything. When Poseidon and Zeus discuss Poseidon's surrender, Zeus remarks that Percy should die because he's a forbidden child, to which Poseidon replies, "Nuh-uh, what about Thalia?" Then he says that Thalia's bravery still inspires demigods to this day, and that Percy is one of those demigods, so he should basically get to live.
Your forbidden son, who should have never been born.
The same as your Thalia, whose bravery still inspires all demigods. Perseus is one of those heroes.
And that's lovely that he's standing up for him, but here's the thing. Most parents, if asked why their children should live, would probably argue that they should live because they're your children and you love them. It's this crazy concept where people want their kids to live just 'cause. But Poseidon can't say that. He has to argue that Percy might have value to the system by inspiring other demigods. And if we think back to our system, we remember that the demigods, as rule keepers, have the job of continuing the customs and rules by indoctrinating new demigods into following the rules. So, interesting that that's the selling point that Poseidon brings up for Percy. So in Annabeth's section, why am I bringing this up in Annabeth's section though? That's a good question. Because Annabeth is part of this system. Percy is new here, he doesn't get it yet, but Annabeth very much does. Annabeth is completely unquestioningly aware that she is not inherently worth anything if she is not useful, if she doesn't make her mother proud, and if she doesn't succeed on her quest. Annabeth is what Wegscheider-Cruse would call a classic hero child.
We're soldiers on a mission. It's not a vacation.
According to Wegscheider-Cruse, hero children are motivated by a deep-founded sense of inadequacy and guilt. They are equated to their achievements. If they succeed, they are showered in praise, highlighted as the winner of the family, the miracle, the golden child. And if they fail, they are punished, ignored, rejected, and guilt-tripped. We can see this very clearly in the way that Annabeth is described versus the way that she's treated in the show's text. Luke presents her as being 6 steps ahead, and Alecto calls her the pride of Athena's offspring, possibly the most powerful demigod child alive. When she makes the mistake of letting Percy send Medusa's head off to Olympus, there's not any help to be found. On the contrary, Athena sends a monster directly into her own temple just to make a point of punishing Annabeth.
How did the Chimera even get inside here? How did any monster get inside here? Annabeth, we're in a sanctuary. Athena would have had to let her in, but why would she do that? Annabeth!
The identifying symptom for heroes is overachievement at the cost of their identity, as they suppress their inner feelings and their thoughts, putting their emotions on the side and focusing on the materialistic world around them because their emotions don't earn them any praise, but their accomplishments do. And Annabeth's backstory actually already lays the foundation for this behavior.
For a while, I was treated like a gift. My father cared for me. He loved me. Then he met a woman. And to her, I wasn't a gift. I was a problem. I was 7. It isn't the gods who think that way. It's everybody.
Her mortal family taught her that she was not inherently good for anything, so naturally, as soon as she enters the Olympian family system and learns that she can gain kleos, glory and honor and recognition from her achieving greatness, she's going to go for the gold that she can. Leading her team into victory, pest Chiron to get a quest, watching over newcomers to see might be the one. It's also incredibly important to her character, Lucas Graham song, that she was only 7 years old when she first entered the Olympian system. 7 is a very formative age, but it's also an age where you maybe don't have the greatest judgment scope of nuance. If we look at Percy at that same age, we have the flashback with Sally. Percy lacks nuance as well at that age, but Sally is there to provide a different perspective, which helps inform a more gray worldview instead of the black and white mentality that Annabeth develops. In the book, Annabeth describes quest as the only way to find any good or not. And I found this particular phrasing really interesting because it's not on quest that you see if you're any good at fighting or planning or surviving. It's where you see if you, as a person, are good or not. While that line isn't in the show exactly, I think the writers still kept that mentality intact in Annabeth's character through other lines of dialogue and actions, which all go to show that to Annabeth, everything is a test. Everything is a way to find out if she's any good or not. Because deep down, I think Annabeth feels deeply inadequate. I think Annabeth knows that the cost of failure is great for her to bear. I mean, she's watched Luke fail his quest, forever changed by it, as well as his relationship with his dad on repair. Annabeth, when we meet her, has no ties to her mortal family. She only has Athena. She can't afford to lose her mother's favor. And how do you maintain Athena's favor, you ask? You become a monument to the power of perfection. And Annabeth readily gives up her own personal beliefs in order to be in her mother's eyes, which again is sort of ironic, because it means she has to, on some level, give up her own critical thinking and logic. It's not that she's not intelligent or somewhat self-aware, it's just that she's also so deep in denial that she can't even admit the self-doubt. She believes in her mother and fully believes that Athena's just always is doing the right thing, especially since she has never been with an alternative, and so Athena's treatment is okay to her. She says that as long as you treat the gods with respect, they'll be in your corner, but we see time and time again that that isn't actually true. It's part of that self-delusion that comes with these dysfunctional family systems, but as a consequence, Annabeth has to beyond the one she has been given peers and her mother. She's never seen a movie, doesn't know what to do at Disney World, and she never mentions any hobbies. She's multi-talented, yes, but she's not multifaceted. When Grover tells Percy about monsters and how they work, he says they don't just feed on fear, they're more complex than that. They're important to know, blah, 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 blah. And when Annabeth speaks to Alecto...
Either way now, it would seem that you're exactly what they say you are. The pride of Athena's offspring. Perhaps the most formidable demigod child alive.
So we get these lines. So while some might view this as bad writing, why is Alecto just info dumping on us instead of showing us that Annabeth is formidable? Well, I propose that it's because she really isn't. She has never been on a quest before. She has, at most, led her team consecutive wins in and capture the flag, which is warfare. She has the reputation of being the pride of Athena's offspring, but I think Alecto is saying this not to praise Annabeth, but to scare her, to make her doubt herself. She highlights the burden on Annabeth's shoulders, of what's at stake, and she tempts her by bargaining with Percy. If she can just hand Percy over, then Annabeth is free to go and prove without him in the way. Annabeth's fatal flaw is pride, so Alecto goes for her weakest point, is her self-doubt. If she fails, she's nothing. She'll never get to prove herself again, she will have lost her mortal parent as well as her godly parent, and then what? Annabeth doesn't react to this, she's invisible in the scene before she changes the subject. And when we move forward, Annabeth is different herself, but instead of that, turning inwards, she projects it outwards in the woods when she gets into a fight with Percy. There's more to these interactions than just exposition, because if that was true, you would think that the show would simply show us how amazing Annabeth is. It actively doesn't. To me, that's also to give her so much like Percy, but also because we're supposed to consider if she actually is. And since Percy is the first person to see past it and try to convince her that she has inherent worth just as she is, that she deserves to be a child, including all the awkward that entails, I think the show is trying to show us that Annabeth, like everything else, is not what we first assume her to be. She is not the most formidable demigod child alive, at least not yet. But she is a 12-year-old kid with a ton of baggage and no idea who she really is or even wants to be. The powerful thing about Percy and her dynamic is that he's the first person to ask if she's really okay with this, if she's sure she wants to be living her life just for the sake of gaining glory. And Annabeth, in turn, questions if Percy is sure he can't more than he assumes. They balance each other out. And I really love that. In fact, when Percy and Annabeth are together, we see and it clashes. And those two worldviews clash with each other repeatedly throughout the show. In the forest, after they escape the bus, Percy wants to get help and Annabeth shuts him down, and we get this really telling interaction.
If we call camp, we're basically saying it was a mistake to choose us. I'm completely comfortable with that. Everyone makes mistakes.
Why are you so afraid of who you are?
What?
Annabeth here is projecting. She assumes that Percy is too afraid to take on this responsibility. Alecto called being a demigod a job. If Thalia had been better at hers, she would have lived.
How things have changed. You're not the frightened little girl I came for all those years ago.
Don't kid yourself. I wasn't that frightened.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
You almost start to think that Annabeth here is simply just replaying a conversation she's already had with Thalia or Luke when she was young. I mean, they're both the same age, but you know, like when she was new. If Annabeth came to camp as a 7-year-old and realized that in the system, if you want to be Athena's favorite, you can't be afraid, you have to focus on the task in front of you no matter what, then yeah, she sees Percy in herself. To her, he just needs to let go of that fear and get it together. The misunderstanding here is that Percy isn't actually afraid. His reaction to this line is earnestly surprised.
What's that supposed to mean? Afraid of who I am? I'm not afraid.
Yes, you are. You aren't just a kid.
He's genuinely okay with making mistakes because he wasn't raised in a household where that was a moral failing. He was maybe given some heat from Gabe, but we know that in this version he didn't take that too seriously. Because Sally, the much more convincing parent, was always there to reassure him. But Annabeth doesn't see it that way. She doesn't see it. She doesn't know any other way to be, so she keeps going.
A kid doesn't do what you did to Clarice back at camp. Just a kid doesn't have Hades sending top lieutenants to retrieve them. You are part of something so much bigger than we can understand right now. We have to move forward, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not. You don't want.
Annabeth is doing a fine job as a rule keeper here. She's actively telling Percy to put aside his mortal side, his moral compass, his feelings, to forget the idea that he's just a kid, and he's 12. She's 12. He's now a soldier, a demigod, and a hero. He has to act like one. The line, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not, is pretty much textbook hero behavior. The urge to be perfect, to achieve greatness, becomes compulsive. Annabeth is beyond the point of questioning how she feels about anything, to the point where she becomes somewhat callous about the very notion of being dismayed.
I want to vote. Who thinks that we should all go get to breathe fresh air and buy our own snacks?
There's no voting. Chips and soda's okay for you guys?
I don't think you should just get to decide we don't vote.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I really love this moment with the voting because it very quickly and very effectively shows us what demigods at Camp Half-Blood are used to when it comes to democracy and making decisions. There's no voting. If you're unhappy with that, that's just too bad. Meanwhile, we also see how Percy is A, able to spot that it's unfair, and B, call it out even though he's not really heard in that moment. But Percy persists in being a kid and clinging to his mortal side, so he suggests that they call a parent for help, which is deeply offensive to Annabeth.
You don't want to call camp? Fine. Then at least let's call your mom.
Excuse me?
Athena? Your mother? I'd call my father, but we aren't exactly on speaking terms, you know, because of the lifelong neglect and all, but you and your mother seem close, so why don't we ask her for help?
When Percy says that he'd call his dad, but he can't due to the lifelong neglect and all, even though Annabeth seems close to her mom, it pinpoints the exact chink in Annabeth's armor that despite being the pride of her offspring, Athena is no less neglectful of Annabeth than Poseidon is of Percy. When Percy realizes that Annabeth can't call her, she tries to get Grover to take over by shifting blame and shifting focus. She puts on this attitude of, I'm not even going to entertain this, but she is wounded by it. And the wound is still raw when we reach Medusa, where that book mentality of monster equals bad shows up in Annabeth for a moment.
Percy, don't! She's a monster.
What's really important about the Medusa scene is that the changes the show makes from the book version actually help to showcase the difference in mentality between Percy and Annabeth, and how the open and closed systems that they are raised in shapes their attitude when met with new information, which is also serving as a sort of parallel to Annabeth's arc in the first season of going from blind trust and devotion to being wounded by it and then having to reckon with that and eventually choose to try something different or to choose not to be bullied anymore. Percy is curious. He's trusting but not naive. Annabeth is closed off, judgmental, and stubborn. Annabeth perhaps puts it best.
Thanks for coming.
This isn't the same for me as it is for you.
Medusa here is really interesting. She serves as a sort of distant family member, returning and providing new information about the family. She's honest and much like Alecto. She does target Annabeth's weakness, her pride, and her fear of failure. Medusa's story in this version works really well on two levels. A is the obvious, this is the more contemporary and sympathetic telling of her story. And B, it serves as a parallel to Annabeth. It quite literally foreshadows what Annabeth is about to experience, and while she now, faced with someone she believes to be a monster, is more than happy to stand by her mother, when it's her who is punished for something the son of the sea god did, she's not so sure.
Something's burning.
And I think it's Annabeth's monument to perfection that's starting to go up in flames here, symbolically speaking. I think now is when Annabeth is forced to reconsider, but it's a slow burn, and we have a long way to go before she's ready to admit how rocky the very foundation of their world is. In contrast, if we look at Percy, he's much more open to this story. He's not loving it, obviously, but he listens with earnest curiosity. When Medusa takes him into the kitchen and refers to his father as a monster, he's shaken, but he doesn't refute it like Annabeth does. He has to consider if it's actually true. If maybe his dad was the monster here. And given his more realistic view of their relationship, lifelong neglect and all, it's probably not that hard for him to accept it. Although he has been taught to be a little bit more lenient, so he doesn't immediately assume that Poseidon is all bad either, or lenient. So he doesn't immediately assume that Poseidon is all bad either. He still hasn't met his dad yet, so he still gives him the benefit of the doubt. The difference is clear. Annabeth flips the script, calling Medusa a liar twice, and enables her mother's unjust behavior by doing so.
That isn't what happened. My mother is just. always coming. That is not what happened. And you are a liar.
Percy takes in the new information and expresses doubt, but he doesn't accuse Medusa of being a liar.
Your mother and I, we're like sisters in a way, targeted by the same monster. So I find myself feeling protective of you.
A monster? My mom never talked about my dad that way.
When Percy decides to send the head off to Olympus, Annabeth and Grover are understandably against that idea. Annabeth protests that the gods will see it as impertinent, and Percy counters that he is impertinent. Because he was raised in a household and a family system where impertinence, to an extent, is allowed. Sally is a little mischievous, so Percy sees it as okay to be a little bit impertinent if it makes a point. And while he reasons that it could also just be seen as tribute, the Olympian family is not going to see it that way. And just like Medusa's story, it's not Percy that gets punished for it, it's Annabeth. And it impacts her. She becomes more standoffish. She has no time for Ares, and I think a part of that is because she's already annoyed and hurt, and so she's biting back a little. After all, she has already been punished unfairly by an adult that she thought she could trust. So I don't find it surprising that she is a little bit more cool in that episode. When we get to Waterland, when Percy and Annabeth are in the Tunnel of Love, it's really interesting to see how their two worldviews actually start to almost switch. They discuss the Olympian family, and Percy admits that maybe his mom should have sent him to camp earlier so that he could have been better prepared. And you would think after all that projecting and assuming that Percy just needs to step up to his potential, that Annabeth would encourage that idea, but she doesn't.
She was trying to keep me away from you guys. Maybe you're right. Maybe she should have been preparing me better.
Maybe she was preparing. When you got to us, you'd be different than this.
This is so important to Annabeth's arc. She's realizing that there is a different way to be and that it might be better. Remember that Annabeth is an architect at heart. She's not about breaking things down for no reason. She's about rebuilding something stronger, renovating, if you will. And then we get the throne scene. Listen, this one got a lot of heat, but hear me out. Remember the color analysis we did earlier where we established that gold represents the divine, power, and the system that Kronos built. And here is Annabeth begging Percy to stand up while he's slowly swallowed whole by gold.
This is a bad idea. Stand up. Percy, stand up. I mean it.
It's okay. I'm okay.
Which could mean nothing. And while Percy is being swallowed by the gold and being sort of captured in the statue, he reassures himself and Annabeth that he's okay, but we can see that he visibly isn't. And we can see that when he comes out of the statue, he is gasping for air because it wasn't okay, it was suffocating him. Who else do we know in the show and in the books who gets swallowed up by something associated with gold that slowly suffocates them until it's too late? That Annabeth might have wanted to beg that he stand up, so to speak. It's Luke. It's a parallel to Luke. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to say it's a parallel to Luke. And that I think it's really interesting to see Annabeth's reaction to Percy here because of that parallel, which is really tragic, especially when we consider the whole thing with Hermes. She talks about it in this way of if they can get Hermes to try and reach out to Luke, that could be a good start for them.
I think it happened to her. And Luke blames Hermes for it. And I think Hermes would do anything to win him back. Maybe helping us is a start.
Which sort of implies that maybe she wants Hermes to step in because she knows that Luke is about to do something stupid, even though she doesn't know what it is yet. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, Percy is swallowed whole by this statue. He's in the statue. He's given very much Easter chocolate. He's given very much Easter chocolate bunny. You know, am I the only one who sees that? Okay, so this one... I mentioned the Easter bunny thing. Oh my god.
he's like giving Easter Bunny, right? So I was like looking up pictures to like compare his statue, because I like had a very specific image in mind that was like, he looks like this. And I just like in my head, I was just like, it's like a kind of Easter chocolate, you know, like Lindt Easter chocolate, like golden wrapping, you know. But I had it in my head, it was like, but it's like a person. Like I feel like I had seen somewhere a sort of Easter chocolate thing, but it was like a human. And then I thought, like, is it because of like Christmas? But then it wasn't that. And then I remembered this very specific Tumblr post. I don't know if you guys know this one, but there's these Benedict Cumberbatch Easter Bunny chocolates. Like, I think they were called Cumber Bunnies. I swear this is real. Like, I'll put pictures up. Like, look at this. This is what I was like, oh, it's that. Like, this is what it reminds me of. It's so horrible. And I know what you're thinking, right? Like, these look like AI. This is before AI was a thing. Like, these are real. These are real. Like, here's a picture of one on This Morning. It's real. These are real. And I think the same chocolatier that made these also has made like a full-size Benedict Cumberbatch statue out of chocolate. I don't know why they're so obsessed with Benedict Cumberbatch, but like these are brilliant and I want one so badly. I don't think they make them anymore. But like, that's what it reminds me of. That's what Percy's giving in the scene.
Looks like whatever. But what does Annabeth do? She takes matters into her own hands. She decides to dismantle the golden system behind the throne by herself. And it doesn't work. And then Hephaestus shows up. And we get probably the most on-the-nose thematic scene in the whole season, besides their bad parents, Percy, and not everything that looks like a monster is a monster. Hephaestus explains that all will go back to the way that it was, always will be, as it should be, aka resisting change, shifting blame, denial, pretty much ticking all of the boxes for the dysfunctional rules here. And Annabeth, the hero child, stands up to him. She puts her foot down and finally breaks, admitting that she's tired of it. She doesn't want to be like that anymore. And Percy is the only person in the family at present time who might just be able to break that system down without violence and manipulation, because he isn't like that. And Hephaestus lets them go. He dismantles the system for them and then breaks Percy out. And what does he say? Some of us don't want to be that way either. Because on a symbolic, metaphorical level, this isn't about the throne. It's about how the change doesn't come from Percy, or even Annabeth, or even Hephaestus himself. The change has to come from Percy convincing the other demigods that change is needed so that they can convince the gods to do what's right. Because the gods set up the system, so the gods have to be included in fixing the system. It's a chain, remember? It's cyclical, and it doesn't take just one person or one generation to break a pattern like that. It takes a reconstruction of the entire system all the way up to the top. If we compare Percy and Annabeth, Percy also represents Nostos. I really hope that I'm saying that right. Nostos? Nostos. I don't know. It's like 4 a.m. Can we not? He longs for a homecoming. He wants to reunite with his mother and go home because he has a home to return to. Annabeth represents Chaos. She has no home to return to. She has no support system besides Luke, and that doesn't last long. We know that Annabeth has never had a supportive system, and her mortal family failed her by rejecting her. On the road, Thalia made Annabeth earn her favor. Her idea of what respect and affection, whether platonic or romantic, is skewed because of this. That's why she seems cold. That's why she isn't good at communicating. She's raised to believe that there's no space for that, so she's never actually had to express it before. She genuinely believes that this is how the world works, and that this is how everyone else works. Percy rubs her the wrong way because he isn't like her, or anyone from her world for that matter. And more baffling, he seems to be happier than her. Now, analyzing Annabeth and her relationship with her mother and father is harder than it is with Percy because we don't meet Athena yet. Can't wait for that though. The outfit is crazy. In a good way. In a good way. I just feel like she needs to be doing like backflips or something. She looks really cool. She looks like a superhero. I'm really excited about it. Can you tell? we're going to have to go off of what her other family members could tell us about how Annabeth's internal system works, how her emotions work, and how she reacts to conflict and whatnot, in order to kind of get an idea of what her ideals are. We can assume that because Athena is part of the There Is No Trauma in Ba Sing Se section of the family system, that whatever she has taught Annabeth is in line with the other gods who are in favor, or at least 50-50 in favor of that system, because none of them are able to speak of Zeus. So if we look at the gods and how they react to various emotions, we have Ares belittling feelings. We have Ares belittling feelings and human weaknesses in episode 5.
Look what I made. What are butterflies for my knee hurt?
Which, if we look at Clarice for a second, also goes to show why she can't tolerate her own emotional weaknesses, or what she perceives to be a weakness. Her fear of being upstage, her inability to handle losses, and her lack of curiosity could very well stem from her father's attitude towards things like pain, childlike wonder, and feeling special in accomplishments. We have Hades, who shies away from conflict, placing himself, ironically, above conflict.
You really don't want the bolt.
Why would I want that?
Start a war between your brothers.
Why would I want that?
Jealousy.
I don't know if you noticed, but it's all candy canes and rainbows down here. I'm managing just fine. I don't really do jealous.
Then we have Poseidon and Zeus, who both seemingly ignore conflict until they physically cannot ignore it anymore. Poseidon seems unable to handle the undercurrent of his own emotions, and when it becomes unbearable, he pulls away and pushes the other party away from him, whichever part of that wave metaphor you like the best. We can see this in the way that he can't look Sally in the eye in their flashback. I think both because he's not allowed to be there, so he feels like he's not allowed to look at her, but also because I genuinely think there's a part of him that can't bear to see the pain that he's caused. When he finally does speak with Percy, he gets overwhelmed by emotion and immediately sends him back. And then we have Zeus, who reacts with good old-fashioned aggression when confronted with his deeper feelings and his own flaws. He also deflects and denies a lot. Hermes, who views distance as a necessary evil, or rather as an act of self-preservation. He ignored advice to stay away and wounded everyone involved in the process. Now he stays away, preventing that same hurt from repeating, but also, in the same turn, he prevents any healing from happening. And as I mentioned, when you can't discuss your feelings openly in these dysfunctional families, eventually you start to feel estranged from your family members, and so you start to assume what they feel and think. And Luke sees Hermes as a stranger, and he's left to assume that Hermes feels no remorse for his situation, when we know that that's not true.
I was warned to stay away from Luke and his mother. Warned that no matter how much I tried to help, I would just make things worse. And I went anyway. And it wasn't just awful for Luke. It was awful for all of us.
Dionysus acknowledges that Percy's luck is in his favor, but he also belittles Grover's feelings and doubles down with aggression when Percy and Grover try to push back on his demands.
I don't want to lie to him anymore.
Come on.
Festus makes angsty draw my life AMVs and traps children. So everyone copes differently is what it's important to remember. Let's not judge too harshly. But he also lies to himself and others by saying that this is the way that things are and the way that they should be, have always been, will always be. My point is that with these examples, we can see that the gods don't really offer any kind of constructive, healthy, or valuable examples of how to deal with their emotions. And so it makes sense that the demigods, and Annabeth especially, who has been in the system since she was 7, would not be able to access her emotions or deal with any kind of conflict in a compassionate way. And that inability to deal with these problems extends to Luke as well.
It's not like there are rules. Of course there are rules. See, that's what warfare is. Knowing the rules. So you can use them against your opponent.
Luke in the show is interesting. He's no longer the stereotypical bad guy, he's more tragic in the show. The text makes a point to drop bits of his lore into the start of the show's run, assuming we get all 5 seasons. Really hoping that we do, otherwise this analysis is going to be difficult. And while this confused me at first, when the show first came out, I think I get it now. I think the point here is to further assist the theme that not everything that looks like a monster is a monster. But as Medusa says, we choose who we make our monsters. So to me, the show is trying to get us, the audience, to consider if we're going to make Luke the monster hero. Which is actually very in line with the books, where Luke is seen as the monster, while he literally is possessed by Kronos and waging war against the Olympians. But in the end, he is the hero of the great prophecy.
As they left, I thought about the great prophecy. The lines now made sense to me. The hero's soul, cursed blade shall reap. The hero was Luke. The cursed blade was the knife he'd given Annabeth long ago. Cursed because Luke had broken his promise and betrayed his friends. By sacrificing himself, he had saved Olympus. Rachel was right. In the end, I wasn't really the hero. Luke was.
And I think the more obvious purpose of meeting Hermes already and all this stuff with Luke's family history being told already in the first season is to create a stronger parallel to Percy. The two have a lot in common after all. Estranged from their father, their mother suffering alone but in different ways. Both are thrust into a quest and fail, and they both have realistic views of this like that. And their parallel actually starts really early in episode 1. Percy talks about shoving Nancy in the nearest dumpster. What he says right before it is really...
Look, I get the Nancy's issues. I'm just getting tired of her taking them out on me. I feel like maybe it's time to do something about it.
Interesting to me, because he says basically the same thing that Luke tells Percy in episode 8. He's tired of Nancy taking her issues out on him and that it's time to do something about it. And then we have Luke saying that they're a bad parent and that they've been getting away with it for far too long, and so now it's time to do something about it. Luke is going to shove Zeus in the nearest dumpster. And then Grover is actually a parallel to Percy in episode 8, because Grover goes, oh no. He sort of tries to be like, oh, I don't think that that's the way to go. Consensus is highlighted in the show, and besides being a funny moment, it's actually pretty important because when we are tasked with breaking down systems or ending cycles, compassion and consensus is the way to go. When we look at Luke and Percy's parallel in the show, there's a lot to say, but to keep this brief, because honestly, it's 4 in the morning, so I'm going to be fast about this. I'm going to focus solely on the way that they represent a way to fight dysfunctional family systems. One is successful and one isn't. The key is consensus and compassion. Technically it's compassion, but consensus is the word that they use in the show, so I'm going to go with consensus. And they're basically a part of each other, right? You can't really have consensus without compassion. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, consensus means to reach a mutual understanding, but unlike a compromise or majority vote, it requires all parties involved to be in agreement, as in all parties must feel that they are getting the best outcome. It sounds complicated, and that's because it is. Often it's something that takes multiple rounds of arguing back and forth until everyone reaches consensus, which feels relevant because the task of breaking down dysfunctional family patterns is also something that requires multiple rounds of reworking the system all the way up to the top. We established earlier the rules and roles of the dysfunctional family, but we haven't discussed how we break those rules and establish better ones. I knew I was going to have fun with that. As established in the Annabeth section, healing the system means healing the entire system. You can't just cut out one part and assume that that makes everything go back to normal or get better, because typically what happens in that case is that everything actually gets worse. Everyone in a dysfunctional family will be impacted in some way, and so they will develop coping strategies that aren't necessarily healthy. And just because we remove the problem doesn't mean that those unhealthy coping mechanisms go away. You have to overhaul the entire system slowly over time and then rebuild each part again over time to prevent relapses in that behavior. According to an article I found, actually beginning to heal and break down these systems requires the following. A. Confrontation. You have to face the problem and name it. B. Emotional authenticity. You have to be earnest and open in how you're feeling. And C. Vulnerability and accountability. You have to let your guard down and be willing to hear out other parties involved. You have to be able to share how you've been the victim and contributor of the system. To the system? It's so early in the morning. I don't like it's light outside. If someone who works on the show sees this, can I get invited to the premiere of season 2? I stayed up all night. I painted my nails. I have the pen. I made this 2 days ago. I made this. Focus, Amy. Come on. Now, if we look at Percy and Luke, they're similar in their ways of viewing the system, but they're not the same. Luke is able to name the problem, but he doesn't have the full picture, and he isn't willing to hear out the gods. He doesn't believe that change is possible. When Percy brings up Hermes, Luke shuts down and attacks, pretty much in the exact same way that Zeus shuts down and attacks Percy. He lacks vulnerability, and he lacks compassion, and he lacks confrontation to the gods, or the ability to confront the gods. And Percy is all confrontation, as we've established, because Luke is still, despite being old enough to have remained critical of the system, a part of the system. He's learned the same rules as Annabeth has, and he's just smart enough to keep his mouth shut about it, while Percy tends to just kind of say whatever he feels in order to preserve a sense of safety. Because while Luke is the person who tells Percy how messed up the system is, we never see Luke actually get into trouble with the gods. We never see him verbally spar with Mr. D or even talk back to Chiron. He tells Percy himself Percy should be careful with what they've been talking about, because that kind of opinion is dangerous. He, just like all demigods in his place, is driven by fear. Luke doesn't know how to open up either. He doesn't know how to put aside the mindset of a soldier. He's not just a kid, but he's not a hero either. So he becomes the anti-hero. He means well, but he gets swayed off the righteous path. Luke doesn't actually have what it takes to confront the gods, to demand change, because he's too aware of the consequences that it'll have. But he also does deny and kind of lied to himself by telling himself that change is just simply not possible. It's not lost on me that if we compare Percy and Luke, then Luke turns invisible to steal the bolt, and Percy strolls up to the front desk at the Empire State Building and slams down the bolt in plain sight for anyone nearby to see. Now, do I think that Luke is just a terrible person and is unwilling to listen because he's just a mean guy? No, not at all. I truly think Luke in the show is purposefully painted in a more sympathetic light because he isn't just like Percy, he is Percy. But instead of being a success story like Percy is, he's the bad ending to the same hero's tale. Their mothers are both able to see through the mist. They both have a closer connection to their respective godly partners. They're both part of the great prophecy. They're both talented swordsmen. They're both deeply angry characters who want what's right. Both know loss and love and struggle with control. But it's important to remember about Luke that when Kronos tries to tide over Percy, he doesn't talk about anger or hatred. He talks about justice, about wanting what was taken from him. Back to great-grandpa. Kronos is the original creator of the rules, and so of course he knows how to play by them. He wrote them. Do not cite the ancient magic witch, for I was there when it was written. That's not at all what he sounds like, is it? He shifts blame, changing the entire mythos of the family. Kronos was not the villain, according to Luke. He was the first victim of the gods' greed and cruelty. He ruled over the golden age, and the gods just couldn't handle being outshone by their dad. If you think all the way back to our family systems, per Wegscheider-Cruse, you might remember that a deceased family member can exist as an idol and as an example of what not to become. Kronos is sort of both. For the gods, he's a cautionary tale, and to Luke and to the demigods who join him, he's an ideal. And to bring back color analysis, might I point your attention to the lighting on Percy's face in the fight scene between him and Luke versus Luke's face. Almost as if the show is trying to retain that Percy is still only... I've been waiting all night to do this. Look at what the slogan says. You can't read that because it's mirrored, but half boy, half god, all hero. But Luke is beyond saving at this point because his face is mostly lit up by gold. And it's not like a bright, vibrant gold. It's this like dark reddish gold. It's not as flattering. He's already on Kronos' side. Who knows, maybe he's already agreed to let Kronos use his body as a vessel. And knowing that this happens to Luke in the future, we could argue that this possession becomes symbolic, more than just a literal scare factor. Kronos' ideals and rules are reborn quite literally into a younger generation, and so the cycle continues, and so Luke becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that baby,
it's very Greek.
Luke in the books is arguably more of a black and white villain. Just like how Percy realizes quite last minute what he wants in the end, Luke's backstory is revealed at the 11th hour. And as much as I can understand the argument that it has more impact that way, I equally think that we can argue that really letting it breathe and giving this plotline space to grow and deepen beyond what the books were able to give us in flashbacks and expanded exposition in dialogue, I think it's a really interesting idea that I'm actually really looking forward to, because I think it's one of those things that the books reveal very late, and then as a fan, you kind of just have to wonder what that was all about. Like, you would have loved to know more about it, but you can't because that's over now. And I think it's a valuable idea, artistically speaking, because why are we asking for an adaptation if we don't want it to adapt or deepen or change our understanding of anything? We just want it to be the exact same thing, but baby girl, that's already right here. That's in the book. You can just read the book. So I'm okay with it. The books make it hard to like Luke at times, but it feels so incredibly in line with the show's thesis to make him more likable here, to make him a tragic hero, not just the big bad, is, in my opinion, the right move.
Annabeth.
I heard everything.
Oh, right, I forgot about that. People really didn't like this dialogue, huh? But let's talk about it, because Annabeth's line here is actually justified in my opinion. There's several layers to this, right? And the surface level one is that Annabeth here is referring only to this instant, that she was here and she saw the whole conversation and she heard everything that was said, which is sort of like, duh, yeah, you were standing right here. Good for you. But Annabeth is not just referring to this moment here. She mentions to Percy in episode 6 that Hermes and Luke had a falling out, and that she thinks Hermes would do anything to get Luke back. Why do you think she'd want them to have a good start again, and to get Hermes, of all people, to try and reach out to Luke again, if not for the fact that Luke was probably already acting weird ever since his quest, according to the books? And Annabeth is a smart kid. She's 6 steps ahead. Do you really think she didn't know that something was up? So maybe she could see that Luke was being weird, and she wouldn't try to get Hermes to speak to Luke if she didn't think that Luke really desperately needed his dad to reach out to him. Which is just, ooh, that's got a little kick to it. It's got, ooh. that in combination with Hermes's face when they mention, just the mention of Luke's name is like,
So you might as well at least play a little.
We're friends of Luke's.
he just needs his dad so badly, and his dad is just too afraid to reach out to him, and you have the nerve and the gall to sit there and tell me that this is a badly written show. How dare you? How dare you? Yeah, it's 4:22 in the morning. You think I'm not gonna get mad about it? Of course I'm gonna get mad about it. That's ridiculous. No, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I might not sleep. I look great though. One thing about me, I clean up nice. We're almost done, I promise. So, when she refers to this moment between Luke and Percy, she's not just referring to that moment. It's implying that she now understands the full extent of Luke's betrayal. He's been planning this for months. He's been against the entire value system that she clings to desperately for stability, and now he's planning on recruiting people and leaving to fight it and break it down entirely. And she, his little sister, didn't get an invite. That's what she's saying here. Sure, it can feel a little cheesy, but what was she supposed to say? What would you have said? I'm not sure I would have said anything. I think I would have just stood there and stared. But if we return finally to our system, Luke here is arguably the scapegoat, right? Not at first, no. But from this point on in the show, he is very much that guy who left and screwed everything up to wage a war against our parents. And Percy is also kind of the scapegoat in the show, but not anymore. See what I did there? You see, Wegscheider-Cruse describes in her 1981 book that the roles of the family can actually change, but when they change, it's rare that two people take up the same position in the system. What's more common is that they swap. So the scapegoat becomes a new hero, and the hero, jaded by their replacement, becomes the scapegoat. And here we see this happen to Luke and Percy. Luke was the hero, he was respected, talented, and well-liked, and now he leaves and Percy becomes the hero. Technically speaking, I think this already happens when Percy returns to camp to applause and celebration from his fellow campers. Luke, not so much. He failed his quest, so we don't actually know if he returned to that kind of fanfare. I would assume not. So the roles have swapped, and I think Percy's arc moving forward will focus largely on whether or not he can manage that role, thus the swaying between, oh, gold and blue. See what I did there? Totally intentional, by the way. Shut up. I know what I'm doing. Hence the swaying between two worlds. Can he stay with the mortality? Is he gonna be all boy, all hero, all god, or like the slogan says, half boy, half god, half hero, whatever. Hold on tight, Spider Monkey. We're almost there. So I think his arc will mostly focus on whether he can manage that role or if he can keep the system from swallowing him whole. And interestingly, I think Luke's arc will be the exact same, but in the opposite direction. Because as it is, Percy has what it takes to break down the system. He meets the gods when he meets with the gods, when he's talking to other demigods, even when he meets monsters, he shows all the traits necessary to break a system. He has compassion, he has the bravery and self-confidence to confront issues head on, and he is vulnerable and authentic emotionally. The only question of this is how it will all develop in future seasons, and if by the end they reach some consensus. His books, even if they have no moral, do have a constant theme, which is the complexity of family life. So where does that land us? Oh, thank God, this is a short one. In short, I think Percy Jackson, Season 1, succeeds as an adaptation because of its fidelity to the theme and thesis of the book. And despite changing things from the source material, those story changes support the theme, bringing a different but still compelling artistic merit to the show. You can apply family systems to the Olympian family and get a good sense of how complicated and dysfunctional it is, and, or how Percy puts it, how big of a mess they are. I think, given those systems, that you can scope out which roles the characters fall into and see how those roles are reflected in their characterization in the show's text. Though whether this is a conscious or subconscious choice on behalf of the writers, I can't say, but I look forward to seeing in future seasons if it's gonna keep going that way, if I was right or not. Let me come to the premiere. I'd love to see. I don't know what this voice is. 4:30 sharp, so. I also think that the show has been largely misjudged by a big part of the fandom, unfortunately, where the focus has been too much on the story fidelity and pointing out surface level differences with too little discussion about how the show as a text and as an independent artwork fares. I think once you dig past that surface and plunge into the depths of the text, you can actually see a story that is very poignant and vibrant and entertaining, and does succeed in talking about the complexities of family structures. Finally, I know that Season 2 is coming out this December, and I'm very excited about it. I am wholeheartedly a fan of the show now. I hesitate to call myself the #1 fan of the show, but I haven't seen any other positive video essays about it. I've only seen negative commentaries, so I don't know, prove me wrong, I guess. But as mentioned, I think we ought to give the show some slack for now because it's still very early on and we have a long way to go before season 5 if we hopefully get all 5 seasons. I honestly don't know what I'll do with myself if we don't get all 5 because what do you mean? What do you mean you're not going to do all 5? You're going to do 3. You might as well do the last 2 at once. So I do look forward to season 2, like an abnormal amount. I think I look forward to season 2 more than I look forward to season 1, which is odd. Like if you couldn't already tell from this video, I'm deeply invested in the show in like a very serious way. Like I love the show. And this isn't even all that I had to say about the show. I had to kind of stop myself and keep things a little shorter than I wanted them to be. And there were tons of things that I came up with along the way that I kind of wanted to talk about, and then I couldn't really get it to be substantial enough, and I was in a time limit, and I just wanted to make this video. So this is what I ended up with. If you enjoyed this video and you're not absolutely sick of me talking about the show, then let me know and maybe I'll make some more, hopefully shorter videos about the show, or just dive deeper into some of the points that I made here because admittedly I kept some of them kind of brief because I just didn't want to take too long. This is already insanely long. It's the morning. I stayed up all night just to talk to you about it. So, and I painted my nails and I made a necklace. So cut me some slack here. Like and subscribe. And join my Patreon if you want to. No pressure. Anyway, I feel like I shouldn't say that the videos will be shorter. I don't want to jinx it. Bro. But yeah, if you did enjoy this and you want to join my cool guy club, you can join my Patreon. I mostly have some art content on there. You can get like animatics and behind the scenes and stuff. But you also would get access to the bonus video that's sort of a sister video to this from way back in that original version of the video where I was going to be like an actual like lawyer and try and defend the show. I'm not really a lawyer. I was just going to pretend. But in that original idea, I wanted to make a bonus video where instead of being the, what do you call that? Defendant? What do you call it? No, it's not. What do you call the lawyer? Attorney of defense, I guess. Instead of being the defending lawyer for the bonus video, I'm going to be the prosecutor, and I'm going to tell you all of my hot takes about the show and what I really didn't like about the show. Perform that job the best that I possibly could, I would have to try and embody Percy Jackson's biggest hater. So I thought, why not just try and embody the #1, the original Percy Jackson hater, Mr. D. So if you want to see that, you can join my cool guy club. A few of you might get superpowers, who knows? And if you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. But if you want to see more from me, then you can subscribe to the channel and all that good stuff. I feel like I don't need to tell you what to do. You know how to do it if you want to. I'm not your mom. I can't tell you what to do. You have free will. Exercise it. Thank you so much to my Patreons who are already part of my club, the original cool guys. Go watch the Percy Jackson show again. I promise you'll like it better this time. Pay attention to the lighting on Percy's face. I mean, it's all the time that they do it. Like, it's so on the nose, which is even funnier considering that no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to talk about it, and it's so obvious. Oh my god. Anyway, take care. Bye. Bye.